This is for looking inside of walls.
Well, we use it for heat exchangers and stuff like that sometimes too.
Oh.
There's different uses.
Will it pick out a squirrel?
Well, usually you can hear them long before you see them.
Oh, okay.
I apologize, we don't have a bigger screen here, but I hope everybody can see it. If you can't, you're welcome to come closer. My name is Darcy McGregor. I've been with Home Allies Home Inspections. In June, it'll be 31 years I've been doing home inspections. I really love doing home inspections. It's lots of fun. Every day is different. And I poke through all kinds of different houses, and I go from really, really good ones to really, really bad ones. And sometimes in the same day. What I've been asked to do today is a maintenance presentation. And if you have any questions on anything as we go through, this is really informal. You just shout out. I can just go on a tangent anywhere you want to go with houses. And that kind of makes it more interesting sometimes. But feel free to ask any questions whenever you want. And you know what I don't have here is I went looking around this morning to try and find a button for my cancer, and I could not find the battery. So I'll have to do it with a mouse. And you don't want to be there either. Maybe I'll just do it this way. So when you maintaining a house, I'm sure everybody here has one. Are any of you my previous clients? I don't see anybody here that I work with, although I forget faces sometimes. Good morning. Obviously, when you have a house, I like to compare it to having a car. You got to put gas in your car. You got to change the tires. You got to eventually have problems with transmissions and motors and all kinds of things. Houses are very similar. They last longer. The life expectancy is over 100 years. Cars only 10 years, but there's still certain things that in the house that are going to fail, and I'm sure some of you have come across that thing. Roofs have to be done every 15 to 25 years. Furnaces about the same time, and if you have the same luck as me, it's usually not the same month. Hot water tanks every 10 years. You're kind of looking into hot water tanks 10 to 15. Some plumbers are going to say less than that. So there's lots and lots of components. Believe it or not, foundations and structures have a life expectancy as well. Whether your house is brand new or whether it's really old, it still requires attention. And a lot of people think, well, I bought a brand new house, I don't have to worry about it. And that, granted, is true on most of the new houses that are making them more and more low maintenance. So you don't have to get out there and paint all the siding. You don't have to get out there and do as much on the windows. But the new construction has its own set of issues, and sometimes it's better, sometimes it isn't. So we're going to start with monthly items, and probably the most common problem on the inside that I see is furnaces and hot water tanks. Most people move in, they don't do anything. And furnaces, especially the new ones, which this one is, I hope you can see that. Maybe I'll bring it up just a little bit. See if that helps a bit. High efficient furnaces, really it comes down to three things you have to do. Filters are the most important, and humidifiers are the second, and then an annual servicing. Now, an annual servicing, when you see what they do, it's not very much, but it is important to, at least if you want to do your own cleaning, I can put a plug in here for the gas company. You can phone ATCO Gas, and they will come out and do a free evaluation on your furnace for the operation of it. Mind you, if they find anything wrong, like a gas leak, they can make you fix it. But that's a good thing. So that's not a bad way to do it if you don't want to have a service company come out. I'm going to talk more about than try and point on here because it is a little bit hard to see. But on a high efficient furnace, the reason that they're able to get so much heat, they're about 90 to 95% efficient. Mid-efficients go from 75 to about 85% efficient. and the old conventional furnaces are somewhere around 40 to 60%. So if you have an old conventional furnace, you're way behind. And those are kind of obsolete. I got some pictures of them. Well, what they do with a high efficient furnace, there's two sets of heat exchangers on them. There's a primary heat exchanger on the top, and on the bottom of it, there's a secondary heat exchanger that's called a condensate heat exchanger. And what it does is when the furnace comes on, it pulls air from outside. They no longer use air from inside the house most of the time. They're supposed to bring it from outside. It starts at the top of the furnace, and that's where your igniter is, and your gas is ignited. And the gas is pulled through the primary heat exchangers, and then they're pulled through a secondary heat exchanger. Now what a heat exchanger does is it contains the natural gas as it's burning. And as it's obviously hot, and it heats the metal, and the metal around it gets, the metal gets hot, and the air around that also gets hot. So the heat is exchanged across the metal. And that is the air that's being heated, is what goes through your house. So the top heat exchangers, some of them are tubes, most of them are metal plates, very close together. They punch out channels in them so the gas stays in there as long as it can. And like I say, about 80% of the heat is extracted from that. Then it goes through what's called a condensate heat exchanger, and I've got a picture of it inside, a little further in here. It looks like a radiator on the bottom, and that's where the excess gas comes out. The coldest air that's coming back to the furnace hits that first, and it takes the last little bit of heat out of the gas. And as the gas gets closer to room temperature, it actually goes from a gas, it condenses down into a liquid. So there's latent heat that's in that gas, and that's what's extracted. That's how they get that last little bit of heat. So because of that, you've got liquid coming out of your furnace. So there's a drain system, and it usually goes down over into the floor drain. So if you're wondering if you have a high efficient furnace or a mid efficient furnace, a high efficient furnace has plastic pipes coming off of the top of it. And they're going usually directly out the side of the house somewhere. A mid efficient has a metal chimney coming off the top, but it has a fan inside the top of the unit. And those ones, the gas comes in at the bottom. I got some pictures, I'll show you that a little bit later. And a conventional furnace doesn't have any of that. It just has gas coming in the bottom, it's open at the top, gravity flow up the chimney. Okay? The mid-efficient, oh man, you just can't see that very well, I'm sorry. Mid-efficient furnaces have, and high-efficient furnaces have a similar type of electrical box. And that box, it's a computer, it's like a motherboard. It controls everything that happens in the furnace. And if anything goes wrong with the sequencing, there's a specific sequence that goes through, it can basically figure out what's wrong with it. And it's almost always on the bottom, and there's almost always a little peephole that you can look in. Most of them just have one red light that will blink. Some of them have a red and a green light, and some of the newer ones have an LED display, and they'll have different numbers that will come up. The reason I'm talking about that is if your furnace does not come on, or is not working, which it's always cold out, they don't break in the summer, because you're not using them. It's always cold out when they break. Go down and look, and that hopefully you'll remember this. You'll look inside, and there'll be the blinks, and sometimes it'll be 1 short and 3 long, or two short and 4 long, and some of them have a great big long list. But if you get down and look and count what the blinks are, or read what the LED is saying, there's a plate, it should be the next slide here, on the front, sometimes in the back, but it will say LED codes. This one only has a 10. I think that was a Goodman or something like that. Those blinks will tell you exactly what's wrong with it. So now what you do, there's a switch up in the ceiling usually that turns off the power to the furnace. You might want to find that and even label it. If we do an inspection, we do that for you. But turn that off, wait a few seconds, like 10 seconds, turn it back on. You've just rebooted the computer, and it will try to run again. And if it comes back and says the same numbers on it, same code, you write down what kind of furnace you have. If you want to look inside, you get the BTU on it. And then you can write down what the LED code says. Now when you phone your service guy, you say, I've got a Goodman 2005, 105,000 BTU. It's blinking 3 blinks, and it says on the codes this. You don't have to know what it is.
But they know now what they need to bring, so they don't have to come and figure it out and go back and get something and maybe spend an extra 2 hours on your house. Simple thing that can be done. If you get confused and don't understand it, just phone the right people. And it's good to have good people. If you don't know a heating guy, if you don't have somebody, it's nice to be able to do that when you got time. So phone around, see who you like to talk to and who they are willing to. Well, most of them will have 24-hour service. But it's nice if you can phone up a guy, especially if you know their name. Hey Gary, I got a problem. Can you come and help me? Same with electric and plumbing. Those are the three that you need. Both roofer. This is what it looks like when you look straight down into a high efficient furnace. You can see how narrow the heat exchangers on the primary ones are. And if you can see it, it's a radiator at the bottom. So that's what they look like inside. Now I mentioned moisture. And this is one of the important things on a high efficient furnace. They have to collect them, and it's not water, it's actually very concentrated gas residue. So there's all kinds of different acids in it. And if it gets out of the train, like this is the collection system on here, there's rubber hoses in there with clamps on them, and sometimes they leak. And that residue, that liquid coming out of there is very corrosive. I've seen it eat the concrete. If they don't take it right down into the floor drain, if it's running across the floor, it will eat right through the concrete over time. And in a very short, geez, you just can't see it, I'm sorry. This one's all rusted up in here. Now, unfortunately, with a mid-efficient, you have to usually take the front cover off. There's quite often screws on it, or thumb screws that you have to take off. But at least once a year, halfway through the year, take it off and take a look inside, make sure there's no rust in there. And the bottom as well. I think this one has rust on the bottom as well. And it's usually a pretty easy thing to fix, unless it's coming out of the induction fan, then it's a new induction fan, which can cost some money. But you definitely want to get it corrected if there's any rust in there at all. So that's a mid-efficient furnace. The induction fan on these are on the top. On a high efficient, they're on the bottom. So the gas in this one starts at the bottom and pulls up to the top and has their conventional chimney on the top. And that's what they look like inside. Now, really on a high efficient furnace, the primary heat exchangers are exactly the same ones that are in a mid-efficient furnace. The only thing that's different is they've turned them upside down and they've taken the exhaust down out of the bottom of the unit. So that's an old conventional furnace. That's actually one of my house a very long time ago before I changed it. And they are just old workhorses. They last forever, but they can crack. Now the heat exchanger, you can see how much larger these are. They're, instead of being close together, they're quite wide. They're relying on the gas to naturally, by convection, rise up and go up through the roof. So if you don't have a combustion air on that, you could have some problems with that. That's a pipe coming in from the outside, feeding air into the furnace return, or into the furnace room, so there's enough air for it to burn properly. Now we're getting back prior to 1977. I don't know if anybody's in an older house in here, but that's where you have to start watching for no combustion air. If you get a furnace guy in, they're going to tell you that you need it. One of the problems that comes with high efficient furnaces, because the exhaust trail is not very hot anymore, 90% of the heat is gone, so it's not very hot. You can put your hand over the exhaust quite easily. But there's also high humidity in that. So what can happen as it gets to the outside, especially when it's 40 below, is that gas will immediately freeze. And this is a train is one of these ones. There's a couple other others. Can't remember which other one uses it, but they've kind of stopped using this one because of the problems they were having with it. They get enough moisture coming out and start freezing up, and at the end of that closes up, or even partly closes up, it will shut down the furnace. There's all kinds of sensors on the furnaces, just like new cars, and if one thing goes wrong, it shuts down. That's what it looks like there. This is more common. I don't know if you can see it, but this is an icicle growing on the ground, and that's the exhaust. if that stalagmite gets to the bottom of this, and it will actually shut down the furnace again. So that's one of the first things you want to look at if it's really cold out. Just go outside, take a look. If that is started to encompass like the previous one of this, you have to take some boiling water and just pour it over top of it until you melt it off. And don't bang it because the plastic will just shatter. Just hot water on it until you get rid of it. This one, when you see it going like this, just go over and knock it over. And just so it doesn't get a chance to build up there. Fortunately in Calgary it doesn't stay that way for very long. But we can, even with the old conventional and a mid-efficient furnace, when it's really cold, oh, you can't see. There's ice coming out of the bottom of the chimney there. So that can happen with a mid-efficient furnace too, if it's cold enough.
So this is on the roof, so how do you deal with it?
Well, if you're not comfortable, you hire somebody. Yeah, pretty much you have to get up there now. It depends, you know, in that particular case, the furnace was still running. Geez, I'm not sure what you could do from the inside. I don't think there's anything that I can think of.
How can you tell that it's got enough freezing out there that you need to do something?
This I saw during an inspection and nobody knew it was happening. And luckily, but what can happen eventually, if that builds up, well, that was a mid-efficient furnace in that house. It probably would have shut down as well eventually when it doesn't have enough airflow or exhaust. There's a sensor on the back that would start the back vent and it would shut down.
Now, is it freezing on the inside of the pipe too, or just on the outside?
It was coming out of the top and freezing out of the side vent.
Okay, so there's not freezing in the inside?
No, it was
Okay.
coming around and
Okay.
getting up to it's a V vent is what it's called, so there's an airspace between the two. So that's really uncommon. I've only seen that once or twice, but it can happen. Now, coming back to the high efficient furnaces, if you talk to heating guys, they're gonna say, when you talk about filters, they're gonna say the best filter for a high efficient furnace is the cheapest filter. And the reason for that is the heat gain that the tolerances for heat gain on these high efficient furnaces is quite limited. And if you let your filter get dirty, it's going to reduce the amount of air that's passing over the heat exchangers, and the heat exchangers won't be able to expel enough heat. So they will overheat and shut down. They'll cool down, and then they'll start again. So that's like running your car until it overheats, and then it's shutting it off until it cools down and turning it back on again. Very, very hard on the heat exchanger, on the heat exchangers to do that. So they're absolutely right. The best filter for a high efficient furnace is a cheap one, unless you change it regularly. The better the filter, the more dirt it collects, the quicker you're going to have to change it out. And so if you go and buy the 3M, the $40 filters, you got to be prepared to start replacing almost every month, depending if you have dogs and cats and where you live. In newer areas where you got lots of dust and dirt from construction happening, if your filter gets dirty, you need to change it. Now there's this one here. It is becoming very popular. The heating companies are starting to put in what's called a HEPA wide filter. They're usually 3-inch or 4-inch wide. They're the same size as the old one. 16 by 25 by 1 is the conventional one, or 16 by 20 by 25. Those are the most common ones. But now you can get these, they're quite wide. The way they work, they've got a longer surface area on them, and they're designed so that they start collecting on the inside and they work their way out. So you can get 6 months if you have air conditioning out of them, or even a whole year out of them with a conventional furnace, or a conventional running of a furnace. High efficient are definitely much more susceptible to that. Mid efficient can be affected, and the old conventional furnaces, you can they'll still run if their filters clogged right up. They still work. Did I see a question? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to know, for mid-efficiency,
Yes.
what sort of filters on that one?
Well, those ones are a lot more forgiving.
Okay.
So that's what I've got in mind. I use the 3M. They're about $20 if you buy them just singly, each one. And I do it every 2 months until I'm pretty much done now. By the time I'll leave the one that's in there. I just changed it first Saturday of every week. So first Saturday of every month, I do my maintenance. And every 2 months in the winter, I change my filter.
And if you're running your AC through the summer,
Every 2 months year round. And some people now, if you're in a newer house, you have what's called a ventilator system of some sort. And there's different ways of doing that, but the most common one, there's a switch on the wall above or around your thermostat, and it should say ventilator on it. When you turn that switch on, it will turn on the furnace fan, and depending on the age of your house, recently, last 5 years or so, it's going to be a bathroom fan somewhere will turn on, usually upstairs. So when you flip on the ventilator, the bathroom fan comes on, it's taking air from the house, blowing it outside. The furnace fan comes on, and there's another pipe coming from the outside called a fresh air intake, goes into your return. That brings fresh air into the house to replace what's being drawn out of that bathroom. And that fresh air mixes with the common air going back to the furnace, so you're slowly changing the air in your house and improving the air quality. Some people run that all the time. Some people run it all the time and they don't know they're running it all the time. What's the switch for? You don't know. But that's what it does. And if your bathroom fan, you can't turn it off in the bathroom, then the ventilator fan is on. And you have to go down and turn the ventilator fan on. Now you'll be able to operate that bathroom fan from the bathroom. When you run the bathroom fan independently, it does not run the ventilation system. Now there's all kinds of different configurations. When they first came out, there was an actual exhaust fan built into the furnace that would turn on, and it would take air right from the return and blow it outside. And there's also an air-to-air heat exchanger. I've got one of those coming up here. So those are the intakes. Yes? Oh, sorry, yeah.
One question, filters here. A furnace cleaning company sold me all metal
Yes.
electrostatic
Yes.
filters.
Yes.
Was I given a bill of goods or?
Do you plug it in?
No.
You just put it in. Those are very good filters.
Okay.
Once a month, take it out,
Right.
vacuum it,
Right.
and then wash it.
Right.
And I'll be getting to that, but when you look on all filters, unless they're really cheap, will have an arrow directional flow on them.
Right.
And you want to make sure that the arrow is pointed towards the furnace fan. And it's really important on that one to work. But you need to wash it. So I've had a couple of those, and I can't find them anymore.
Oh.
So I've gone to the 3M, but I love that because I had an extra filter I put in, vacuum it, rinse it, let it sit overnight. The next day I would put it back in.
And the other question was, I use those cheap filters,
Yes.
$5 or whatever.
Yeah.
They're very expensive for it to go through. Now, I tend to spray, like Pam, when you spray
Sure.
on the thing. Is that good or bad?
I've heard of that before, and it would probably, what that's going to do is it's going to make it less porous. So it's going to collect more stuff.
I barely spray the stuff in.
Yeah, I know. But that's just, it's basically an oil, right?
Right.
So the moisture is going, or not the moisture, the dirt is going to be attracted to the moisture, or to that dampness. So it does work. I've never done it myself, and I wouldn't get too crazy with it, because then it's just going to slow down the airflow, and then you run into the heat gain. It's called heat gain problems. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
When we had our basement developed, they said that if we actually leave the fan, the house fan on all the time, that it'll circulate the air better and therefore keep the basement warmer.
That's true.
Yeah. So
You're going to be doing several things. You're going to be circulating the air. Now, if it's a two-story, it's called stack effect. Hot air tries to go up. And if you've ever opened up an attic hatch on the second floor and somebody opens a window or door downstairs, your hair goes up, even my little bit of hair. The air is trying to get up to the top of the house. And in the winter, that's where the hottest air is trying to get to. and in the winter, the coldest air is in the basement. So if you turn on your furnace fan, you are taking air from the basement, main floor, and upstairs. It's all mixing together and going back into those areas. So it makes sense that you're going to have more even temperature. It's still not going to be perfect unless your house is balanced properly. And you'll also have more even humidity levels. And that's really important in the winter. If you don't have proper humidity control, as soon as you start seeing moisture on the bottom of your windows, do something about it. Turn your humidifier off. Start ventilating the house. Bathroom fans, kitchen, if you got a ventilator fan, turn it on. And leave it on until it starts going away. Because it starts on the windows, and it gets worse on the windows, then it goes into your walls. And when it gets into your walls, that's really bad, because you don't know it's there. Okay? So humidity is one of the biggest problems. And I'm going to talk about this one, because these people, this was an old conventional furnace, but they found it was too cold, so they went outside and they put newspaper in on the intakes for the furnace and the fresh air intake. And I'll show you a little later what the result of that was. Don't ever do that. You're balancing between energy efficiency and air quality, especially in brand new houses. And because of that, they're building the houses so tight now. That's why that ventilation system I talked about has been put into place, because the house is like a bubble. And if you don't change the air, it's sick house syndrome, just like a sick building syndrome. You're not getting the proper airflow through your house. My mom used to open up the windows and doors every Saturday year round, and we'd clean all Saturday morning. And that was the best thing you could possibly do, changing that much air in the house, but it's not very energy efficient. Instead of taking the air from that ventilator fan system that I was talking about, you're taking air from the bathroom, which you've already paid to heat, and dumping it straight outside. And you're bringing cold air, especially when it's really cold, you're bringing that in. Now you got to reheat that. So that's not very efficient, but it is good air quality. So what some houses will have is a simple air-to-air heat exchanger, or heat recovery ventilator. And the simplest one utilizes the furnace fan. So instead of having a ventilator fan from a bathroom or some other means of exhausting, they take air right off of the furnace, they allow it to go outside, they bring fresh air, the equal amount of fresh air back in, but they make it go across a set of fins, or barriers. The hot air is on one air, the bad air going out, the cold air is on the other side, and there's a whole bunch of them. And the heat is moving to the cold, so the heat air that you're trying to get rid of is heating up the cold air that you're bringing in without contaminating it. And these run about 70 to 75% efficient. I hate to say 80 because I don't think it quite goes that high. But that makes a lot of sense. You're only having to heat up maybe 30% of that air coming in. And every time your furnace is operating, you're changing air. So it's still going to cost you some money, but you're going to have much better air quality. The only issue with these ones is if you've got air conditioning in the summer. Air conditioning units are struggling in Calgary. They try to keep them a little bit smaller than they need to be because we don't really have huge need for air conditioning. So with an air-to-air heat exchanger, you can actually, might even have to cut them back a little bit in the summer. And that's where you might need a heating guy, an air conditioning guy to help you with that. I wouldn't just stuff some newspaper in there, but that's basically what happens. They slow it down in the summer.
Is this an additional piece of equipment
It
on your
is.
furnace?
It's very, very, I shouldn't say uncommon. It's requirement now to have a 1.5 air change mechanical operation in your house. So they do it with a ventilator fan. This one's way higher than that, and it costs more to put in. And this is, I'm really sorry you can't see these things. These ones are the cheapest ones. You can go upwards of just getting the compartment. They're almost as big as this table, and they run about $4,000 plus all the piping. Now those are collecting air from the high humidity area, so each bathroom, the laundry room, usually the basement and around the kitchen, and they're controlled independently. So you'll have a humidistat control on the wall that will turn on that device, and it pulls air from those areas, blows it outside, and brings the same amount or slightly less air in. And they capture that air and it goes back into the heating system. And that is totally independent of the furnace. And they're very expensive. But I do see them. Some people, especially if they have children with asthma and stuff like that, I've seen all kinds of ingenious ways to improve the air quality, filtrations, HEPA filters, there's all kinds of stuff out there that you can get if you have problems with that.
Do they operate independently of your furnace?
That particular type, yes.
But an average one?
This is what this one is here. It just runs off of the furnace fan. So whenever you can, most furnaces, on the thermostat, you can turn the fan on. And if you do that with one of these units, you'll be constantly moving air. So the advantages is better air quality, better humidity control, better, more even temperature control. Disadvantage is noisy, drafty, and uses electricity and wears out your motor. So you're balancing it, yeah. It's always a balance between air quality and energy efficiency. Oh, sorry. That's a picture of the fins. So they're metal fins, and those always have filters on them as well. So if you're doing a filter on your furnace and you have one of these, you need to do the filter on the air-to-air heat exchanger as well.
What would the normal cost of one of these?
Those boxes, the box itself is probably around $600-700. I normally can't give costs. In the home specs, and the Alberta government doesn't allow us to give costs. So I'm kind of rusty on my costs.
Yeah.
And here I can talk about them all I want. Furnace, 6,000. Hot water tank, 800. I mentioned earlier humidifiers, and the one that's on here, it's called a flow-through drip humidifier. They're the most common ones now. They're usually on the return air or sometimes on the above the furnace. A gray box usually. They have a pipe that comes either from the furnace to the unit into the return, or from the unit to the return. Air is pulled off of the main plenum. It's driven through inside. There's a filter that looks exactly like this, and the air is pulled through it. When there's a humidistat that looks like this usually, or it can be on your thermostat, depending on how modern your thermostats are. When the humidistat is calling for heat, and when you turn these, I don't know if you can hear that little click. The humidity in here today is about, if this is correct, about 20% relative humidity. You want to keep it somewhere around 30% is where you want to see it. 35 if you got a bigger house. And again, as soon as you see moisture on the bottom of your windows, open the blinds and turn on your ventilation system, or turn on your furnace fan, or open a couple of windows a little bit. Just I'm talking winter time, that's when you're only going to see it, unless you got a really good air conditioner. You're bringing the outside air in, and it's usually very dry. And as you heat it up, it's able to absorb the moisture in the air. So you're heating it up, but you're also reducing the humidity in the house. Anyway, the humidity on this one, when it calls for humidity, there's a little solenoid valve that opens up, allows water to trickle down through this. There's a drain on the bottom, goes over to the floor drain. And as the air goes through, it picks up the moisture as it's going through. When there's enough humidity, the solenoid valve stops and the water stops running and the air continues to flow through it. But even though it's flushing itself, you will still get calcium deposits on this. And have any of you seen that commercial when they're putting one of these in the CLR? Oh, it's really impressive, but they're taking all the galvanization off as well as the calcium. And when they put it back in within a month, it's going to rust out on it. That's too aggressive. A little bit of vinegar is good enough. Rinse it really good. And you can usually get about 5 years out of these. They only need to be cleaned about once a year.
Is it worth replacing with one of those, the old drum type of thing?
I prefer those, personally. And the reason being, these use a ton of water.
Okay.
If you ever watch when they're running, there's this constant trickle going into your floor drain. Now that's good because it keeps the floor drain primed, but it is a waste of water. Everybody says it's a waste of water. The water still goes back into the rivers, and we're not losing it, but you're cleaning it on one end, servicing it on the other, and it costs the city money to do that. I prefer the drum, but this one you can do once a year. A drum you have to do 2 or 3 times a year. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So the typical flow through, I think the next picture shows one that's really corroded up. I don't know if you can see it there, but I've seen these so bad that there's fuzz growing off of them, literally. And that's, you're not going to clean that. You need to replace them. Yes?
How can you tell if it's actually working? We bought a house and I just can't tell.
Okay,
Is there a quick way?
turn your furnace on. Make sure your furnace is heating.
Okay.
This can be a little bit, it's not bad if there's a pipe coming in on the top. Just gently lift it until it comes out of the top, and if there's water coming out of it, it's working.
Okay.
Now, you can also take the bottom off. There's a drain on the bottom. Just follow that pipe and look at the end. If water starts coming out, it's working. On the front of these, let me go back one if I can. I don't know if you can see that little black emblem in the middle. You can just put your finger in there and pull that off and look inside. You don't have to take it all apart to see inside. But that'll give you an idea of how dirty it is. If you have to clean it, well, this is one type. There's other types of pieces that you pull off of the front and you pull out. There's different models. This one has a whole bunch of screws that you pull apart. You take it all apart and you have all these pieces. And that's where this one actually comes out of. The more common ones I'm seeing these days, they actually, you take the front cover off and you can get right at these. And those ones are usually plastic, and you just replace the metal part. So if you're in doubt, take the piece that you need, go to Home Depot, and if you get the right guy or girl, I go in there and sometimes I can't get out. Boy, you seem to know what you're talking about. How would I do this? What do you do? It's kind of fun, but sometimes you're busy. So that's what they look like. So you're asking about a drum type, and this is a little more antique, but this is typically what they look like. You can't see it falling apart. Lots of calcium on them, dripping all over the place. They have a float valve in them that has there's a pan, and there's a float in there connected to a water supply. As the water is turned on and it goes up, the float valve comes and it hits the end of the water line, which is about the size of the end of a pen, and it just turns the water off. And as it evaporates, it lets more in, it just goes back and forth like that. You got to keep that really clean. You got to keep the pan clean, and the drum works the same way. Hot air comes off the plenum, goes through the inside of the drum, pulled through it to the outside. When the humidistat comes on, the drum starts turning, and the drum dips in the water and is wet. When there's enough humidity, it stops turning. Those aren't as common, but I like them because they just use the water that you're using for humidity. Really important to clean them and to turn them off and drain them in the fall, in the spring. When you're no longer heating and no longer need humidity, the flow-through ones, you just turn the humidistat off and they just sit there. So it's still a good time to clean them up. And if you have air conditioning, you need to close. There's a damper on them, and it usually says summer or winter. If you're going from the heating season to the cooling season, you need to close that little damper. And the reason for that is the air is still going from above the furnace, which is now being cooled, so it's now very cold air, goes through the humidifier back into the return, and it goes back down, and it comes back against the evaporating coil on the air conditioner. Well, that is cold air, and you need hot air going over that to take enough heat away, or out of the air from the house, so that it cools properly. And if it's cold air going across there, your evaporating coil will freeze up, and that's very bad on your air conditioning. So you need to close the damper if you have air conditioning and a humidifier in the spring. And when you go back to the heating cycle, turn it back to where it says it's either open or it says winter. If it says winter, summer, that's easy, and that's specifically for air conditioning. So we already talked about the humidistat. Boilers, I would say they're not that common, but that's not exactly true. I'm seeing more and more and more of them, and in all kinds of configurations, especially and almost always for underfloor heat. And we were having a little discussion at the beginning here that whole industry has changed quite a bit in the last 10 years. Actually, in the last 2 years, it's changed quite a bit. We used to be able to use hot water tanks as underfloor heat sources. No longer allowed to do that, so it becomes a little more difficult if that's what you've got when it comes to the time to change your hot water tank. If you hire a plumber, he's not allowed to put that system back into operation. He has to change it to the new system. So that can cost you a lot of money, upwards, well, definitely a little more than 3. And if it goes to a completely separate system, you're getting up to $7,000 or $8,000. So just changing a hot water tank can get a little expensive. And I don't know if you can appreciate that. You just can't see it, I'm sorry. This has got 2 high efficient boilers. They're using those in series, or while they're in parallel, to provide hot water for the hot water domestic water system. They're using it to heat high velocity airflow through the house, so like a furnace. They're also using it to heat all the floors throughout the house. Very, very extensive. This was about a 20-foot wall, all just boilers. Neat house, Mount Well. And that one I took because that's the other end of the spectrum. And I don't know if you can see it, but that is a really old steam boiler, and it's covered in asbestos on the outside. That's a whole other ball of wax. That hasn't been used that way for about 40 years. There's not many of these left. This one's gone too, by the way. I'm sorry to see it go. It's a neat system.
Isn't just the asbestos a problem?
Removing the asbestos this is a piece of asbestos right here, actually. And it's not as dangerous as people might say unless you take it and you start rubbing it. Even if you break it, it's not really a risk. This is asbestos sheeting. They used it all the time for heat reflection. But when you have it like that, it's called friability. And if I drill through this, now the fibers that are in it can be released, and that's dangerous. When it's like this, there's linoleum, up until about 1985. We gotta watch our time. We're gonna have a break somewhere, whenever you want to do it. The linoleum is one of the more frequent ones that I still see. Right up until the early 80s, 83, 84, they were still using linoleum with asbestos backing on it. The cheapest and easiest thing is to just go over top of it. Removal, it's a low-risk removal, but it's still, they gotta wear the suits, they gotta have the whole area sealed off, and it's expensive. Asbestos is not a fun thing to have to deal with. A lot of it's still on old ducting. Back in the 50s, 40s and 50s, they used, it looked like brown tape around the ducts to seal them. Now we use silver tape. Back then it was a gray or brown tape. Hot water tanks. Again, there's a few things that you can do on hot water tanks to help maintain them. The service valve that's above them, a lot of them these days have just got a little ball cock shut off that look like this. They sometimes are longer handles. The older ones have the old gate valves, which is sort of like this one here, where you would actually turn it on and off. Whichever one you have, at least once a year, maybe twice a year, go through and your water main, turn it off and on. Be prepared if it starts leaking to do something about that. Above your hot water tank, your laundry, underneath sinks, underneath toilets, at least once a year, go around, turn them off, turn them on. If it's a gate valve where you turn it, close it all the way. It's sometimes good to have water running through it when you're doing that, by the way. Turn it all the way open, but don't leave it all the way open. Come back a half a turn. And the reason for that, the plastic ones are a little more forgiving, but the metal ones, if you have metal on metal, I've seen tons of them that get frozen there. They get seized, and then you turn them and they leak. So like I say, if you're going to start doing this, be prepared. If they leak, you're going to have to fix something. But it is a good idea. If you've got a new house or you start doing it, you do it once or twice a year, that's all it takes to keep those working, usually. The next thing on the hot water tank is the pressure temperature release valve. And you probably would recognize it like that sticking out the side of the house, or the side of the housing of the furnace, hot water tank. If We've all read that little tag on there, I'm sure, and none of us have. These are safety devices, and what they're designed to do is if the pressure in the system goes above 150 psi, which is very strong, most houses is somewhere around 60 to maybe 80 pounds per square inch. So it almost has to double before this would release. But if it didn't, there was a really good, was Mythbusters, where they plugged one of these off and they blew it up, and it went through a 2-story house and went about 100 feet in the air and landed about 2 blocks away. It became a missile. These are really important that they're operable. And what you're supposed to do on these, and quite often we'll have a hose on the side of them, going from here down to within 4 inches of the floor. It should be copper. It's called just an extension, because when this does release under 150 pounds per square inch, you don't want to be anywhere near it. And if you are going to get near it, you want to be able to stay away from it. Anyways, what you're supposed to do on these is pull them in and out with a bucket underneath them once a year. In, out, a couple of times. Now what that does, the spring that's in here, it just pulls the spring away and the plug away, and it's going to flush it out, so there's no corrosion in there. This piece that's sticking out here is a fuse. If it gets to boiling point, it will also release the system. Now it would also be a very dangerous, now you're talking steam. So these are really important, and I've seen people that have put plugs in these because they start leaking. That is the most dangerous thing you can do in your house. It's got to stay open, and if you do that, plumbers, a lot of plumbers say don't do that because they'll leak. And they're absolutely right. When you get around 10 years old, they may start leaking on you. So you got to be prepared again. If you take it off, you got to drain the tank, spin it off, a little Teflon tape, spin it back on. You've changed it. They're about $20. But the plumber doesn't like to do that. He wants to replace your hot water tank. Okay? Manufacturers definitely say do that once a year. If you've got a 10 or 12-year-old tank, I would probably go with the plumbers on this one and start budgeting for a new tank and leave it alone unless you're prepared to replace it. Okay? I don't know if you want to add that one or not. The last thing is flushing the hot water tank. How many people here flush their hot water tank every month?
Every month?
How many people do it every 6 months? How many people do it once a year?
Yeah.
I do mine 4 times a year. Doesn't seem to make much difference. What happens inside a tank is on the top where the cold water comes in, it should say cold on it, and that's the one where the valve is. A lot of times I see them put in backwards, by the way. Like, just want to check that if you don't seem to have much hot water. The water goes down the inside of the tank, down the tube, disperses at the bottom. That's where your heat exchanger is, the gas heat plate, heats the water. Water gets warm, rises to the top. Hot water comes off the top, leaves sediment on the bottom. That's what the valve is for on the bottom. You're supposed to open that, let a few gallons of water come out to flush any loose material on the bottom. If you don't, I've seen these tanks with 1 inch, 2 inches of sludge on the bottom. Tank still works. As a matter of fact, it'll plug any little hole that might be there. Might last longer, but it's less efficient. So a couple times a year, I do mine 4 times a year, it seems to be enough.
How much do you drink?
Most houses, if you have a hose on this, you're getting about 3 to 5 gallons a minute, depending on the size of your pipes.
Will you drain the whole tank?
No, because it's just like opening a tap upstairs.
Oh, okay.
Water keeps coming. It's just you're drawing from the bottom.
Okay.
Don't turn anything off.
Oh, okay.
Just I put a bucket, I'm an old Scotsman, I put a bucket underneath, fill up the bucket and go wash the floor with it. Because it's nice hot water, right? But it only takes a few gallons, 3 to 4 gallons in a minute. So I use an old can thing and I fill it up. It's a couple gallons. And that seems to be enough. You'll probably get it, if you've never done it, it might come out black to start with. That's just crud on the bottom. And after that, you get little particles. And if you keep getting particles, just keep going until you don't get any particles. If they don't come out, they're stuck and you're not going to get them out anyway. Okay?
There's no way to introduce, when you're doing the cleaning job, to introduce maybe a mild.
No, don't do that.
Mild acid or vinegar.
If you want to do that, buy a water softener. Now, water softener, when you get into high demand hot water tanks, I like to recommend the water softener. I'm not a real fan of this, I call it slimy clean versus squeaky clean. They're both clean, but they just feel different, right? But water softener changes calcium to sodium, which is a mild acid. So an actual by using a water softener, your taps will stay more operable longer, your hot water tank will stay cleaner inside, and especially with a demand hot water tank, you'll have less trouble with those. The last thing on those is temperature control. And if you have little children, I've had to turn ours back because I'm a grandpa now, and I've got a 3-year-old granddaughter, and I'm not going to let anything happen to her. We used to have our hot water tank so hot that you couldn't stand it. Now we've cut it back. Exponentially, when you get over 130, well, as you get higher, but 120 degrees is what a demand hot water tank is, factory set at. And you can turn it on straight hot water and keep your hand underneath that. Hot tub is 104 degrees, so it kind of gives you an idea. Anything over 130, 140 is getting way too hot. Exponentially, it takes less time for you to be scalded by it. So you want to look at your temperature, and also, how many of you have ran a tank out of hot water? Probably all of us at one time or another, right? When you take the water in Calgary, winter and summer, it's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is Celsius. Not very warm. Not very warm. And if you're going up to 140, that's 100 degrees Fahrenheit that you're changing the temperature. That's pressure that's building up in the system and in the tank. It can affect the longevity of your hot water tank. So the lower you can keep the temperature, the more efficient it is, and the longer your tank will last. So on these, a lot of them will say hot, then they'll go A, B, C, and then they say very hot. If I see it above B, I caution my clients, because you're getting up around 135 degrees.
What if you have a hot water heating system attached to it? You still keep it at the same temperature?
Yes. Now your hot water heating system, it's a little different. That has to run at 110 degrees, which is too low typically for domestic use. So quite often on that system that we were talking about, it usually has what's called a mixing valve on it that'll let some of the water come back to the tank. So if you're sitting at 130 degrees, the mixing valve will let a certain amount of that come back so it stays at 110 degrees. So there's a way to do that. But that's my tank. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's kind of milky when it comes out, when it's dirty. And I used to carry this around, but it got too awkward, and I moved a couple of times and it disappeared. I took a hot water tank and cut it in half and looked inside. And this particular one had about 1.5 inches of sludge on the bottom. I should have left it in. I cleaned it all out, and it was dumped. I should have left it in. But that one had a crack on it. Pressure release valve, we've already talked about. On-demand hot water tank. I get a lot of questions about these, and they are very good. But they require, the maintenance we were talking on the other ones, kind of suggestion, flushing the tank, kind of suggestion. These ones, you must service them every year. Ooh, you say, every year. Especially if you don't have a water softener. Because what's happening is, on these, the cold water comes in on one end. On a conventional hot water tank, you're heating that water up to a certain temperature, and it stays there within a few degrees, tank coming on and off all the time. So if you're gone for 3 weeks, it's keeping that water ready for you. These tanks have no stored water at all. When you turn on the hot water, it comes in at 40 degrees at the bottom, goes through a massive heat exchanger, comes out the other end at 120 degrees or 130, whatever you set it at. That takes a lot of energy. The minimum size on, well, you get about 100,000, but for domestic water, 150 minimum. And most furnaces are like 80, 90,000 BTUs, so they're double. On 199, if I was putting one of these, 199,000 BTU is the biggest one you can get domestically. I would get nothing but that. It takes a lot of energy to go up that many degrees. And because the water is going from such a low temperature to a high temperature, some of the calcium will precipitate out inside the tanks. And if you don't flush that out, within a few years it will become a very expensive anchor. It will not work properly. These also have restrictors on them. The higher you set the temperature, the harder it is to reach that temperature. So if you turn on a bathtub, it'll easily keep up with one bathtub. You turn on another bathtub, probably, and then you turn on maybe the dishwasher. it's gonna have trouble. So what it does is it slows down the water that's going through it until it comes out at the right temperature. So all of those devices will get lower water volumes. And that's supposed to happen inside those. Okay? So they're not everything that you might think they are. And to flush them, you require, I don't know if that's the next picture, well, on the bottom of them, when they first put them in, they didn't have these flush systems on the bottom. It's just a series of valves. And what those valves are for, it allows you to isolate the tank, turn it off, and then you have to add a pump system to that to flush. Well, vinegar works fine. You can buy a solution, but it's expensive. Just go buy a gallon of pickling vinegar. And the next shot here is the device. It's basically a 5-gallon pail with a pump of some sort. RV pump will work, and a few pipes. So you get the hoses they use for washing machines. They fit onto the tank. They fit on either side of the pump, and then you fill up the 5-gallon with pail with some vinegar. You have to turn the unit off and isolate it. Open up the valves. Turn on the pump. And you take that vinegar and you pump it through the system. Cannot be on. You have to turn everything off. And you just let it run for half an hour or 45 minutes. Then you can rinse it if you want. And that was somebody who was asking, can you introduce something to it? You're introducing something to this system. You can throw your vinegar, clean up your humidifier, whatever you want to do with it. Flush a little bit of clear water through it if you want. And then close everything off, open it back to the way it was to begin with, and let it run again. Very important to do that at least once a year. And that's why I would say it's a lot easier to put a water softener system in if you're going to put in a high-demand hot water tank. Another one of the problems I see very, very regularly in my job is dryers and dryer vents that are not kept clean. And you talk to the fire departments, they respond very frequently to dryer fires. And it's easy, especially if you got a lot of kids, the poor old dryers are going constantly. And not all the lint gets caught in your I don't know if you see it there, but in the lint trap. But keep that clean. And at least once a year, if you got children, pull your dryer out, pull it apart, vacuum it out really well, go outside, clean it out on the outside. Some of them on some new houses are going up through the roof. That's a little bit more difficult. But those ones are really important because when that warm air gets up into the cold attic, even though it's insulated, it can condense inside, get wet, and you get all kinds of mucky lint building up on the inside of your dryer line. So you want, now when if you get your heating ducts cleaned, I'm not a real advocate of that. Every 5 years is adequate for that. Furnace, filter, the furnace itself, keep it clean every year. But when they do the ducts, they'll offer to clean that out as well. Extra $20 or something, it's well worth it. Unless you can really get at it and clean it yourself. Okay, but it is important. Floor drains in the basement. I do see it quite a bit still, and I've actually got an example here. This is from a kitchen sink. But a P-trap in a basement floor drain is the same as this. And the reason for a P-trap is to keep sewer gas from coming back into your house. So if you add water to this system, the water will rise up and it will run down. If this is going out to a drain somewhere, it will run down, and it has to be at a 1/4 inch to the foot. The water will run. When you stop adding water, the water will find a level here, and sewer gas can't come back because there's water there. Now in a kitchen sink, you're going to be running water all the time, but in a floor drain, how often are you putting water down? Almost never. So what can happen if it sits there long enough is the water can evaporate out, and all of a sudden you'll be getting a sewer smell. There's methane gas, and there's, if your neighbor having to clean up some Varsol or gasoline, all of those things can come right back, and it's usually right beside your furnace. Not a good thing to have happen. So you want to throw a little bit of water down your floor drain 3 or 4 times a year. So if you happen to be flushing your hot water tank 4 times a year, wash the floor and put it down the floor drain. Now, if you don't wanna do that, some people are gone 6 months of the year, lucky you. Take some, canola oil, like cooking oil, and put a cup, after you filled it up with water, put a cup of canola oil in there. It will sit on the top, and it doesn't evaporate as quickly. Okay? Flush it out when you get home, because that can kind of get stinky and skanky after a while too, but if you want to, try and keep that in there. Now, if your floor drain, if your water softener goes into it, or if your condensate off your furnace or off your humidifier, then that's going to get water half of the year anyway. Okay, so it's not as big a deal. But you do want to look at that. Now, one of the questions that you will get on your insurance, and our industry is unfortunately kind of connected with the insurance industry, because they will demand certain things. And they want to know, does your house have poly B? We're going to talk about that in a minute. It might be some of you guys. Does it have aluminum wire? Does it have, how old is the roof? How old is the hot water tank? How old is the furnace? How old is this? And they're checking off certain things, and they're figuring out their risk when they ask you those questions. So one of them that they're asking since 2013 is, does your house have a whole house backwater check valve? I wonder why. How many houses were flooded in Calgary in 2013? Lots of them. A backwater check valve, I've got these in the wrong order, but I'm going to be coming up to that. They're now required in new houses. They are fastened onto your main sewer line as it's going out of the house. And it's a valve that simply sits on the bottom of the sewer pipe. The sewage goes over it. There's floats on the valve. If the sewer ever backs up, it picks up the float and it stops the water from coming back, sewage from coming back into your house. 99% of houses do not have it. If your house is older than 2000 and, I would say, well, 2013 for sure, or 12 maybe in there, it probably does not have it. I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. What you can do to add a little protection is one of these devices, which is this one right here. It fits into your floor drain. It's the same size as your drain. It's going to make it this is a 4-inch, it goes down to about a 3-inch. It fits into the throat of your drain. You tighten up 4 bolts on here. It squishes out to hold itself into place. If you have sewage coming, it drops, lets the sewage go down. If there's ever a sewer backup, it stops right there. These are $30. In my opinion, well worth putting it in your house. It won't stop liquid completely, but it will stop solids. And if you've ever had it cleaned up, it's worth every penny. That's what this is. And on some of the older houses, when they put laundries with drain into the floor drain, you quite often get soap coming back up. These are excellent to help prevent that. Like this one.
As far as where you live in the neighborhood kind of thing, I could appreciate a house being on the lower down the hill than on the top of the hill. Is the guy on top of the hill going to have an issue like that?
They could, depending on where the backup is. Because now what we're talking about is the sewage system. And you're on the same pipe as the guy at the bottom, and obviously sewage runs downhill, so the risk is higher. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have a blockage from your house to the sewer.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that there couldn't be something in the sewer that blocks it at the top of the hill, and it doesn't. It's at the top, it's blocked. It's not as often because usually it gets pushed through, but you see these, when the guys are in the streets with those machines and they're pulling wires back, they're cleaning out the sewer. And it can be anywhere, but you're right, the risk is higher down here at the bottom, there's no doubt. But it can happen anywhere. My money, these are.
So what do you call that, gizmo?
A backwater preventer.
Okay.
And there's 3-inch and 4-inch. This is a 4-inch.
Right.
And the 3-inch is very common as well.
And where do you install them?
Right into the top of the floor drain. So you take the cover off the floor drain, it fits.
Okay, right.
If this was the right side, it would fit right into there. And you tighten up the 4 bolts on the top. And it's very easy. Yeah.
Is the floor drain the same thing that your furnace and humidifier and stuff will be draining into?
It can be. And that's okay. The only thing is these springs that are on here, if your furnace is going into it, it'll probably rust it out in a year or 2. But it would still kind of work. Even though there may not be a spring on there. I took this one out because the spring was weak. It's not tight.
Is there a way,
This was in my own house.
is there a way to tell if you got the right thing? You know, if you're
The
looking
right-
at a drain and there's hoses from your hot water tank furnace going into this,
Yes?
how do you know that there might be another,
Oh, something else going into it?
no, how would you know if there's another,
Check valve?
yeah, or another place where you should be installing something like that?
Oh, one of these, well, floor drain is the only place they work. If you have, I think, the next picture here, if you have a bathroom down in the basement, they have to put in what, I don't know if you can see it there, but it's called this is a gravity check valve. And that's required on any bathroom in a basement. Now, that goes back 50 years, and so if, unless you're in a really old house, it's gonna have one of these. And the way that works is as the sewage goes by, it opens up and then it drops and it prevents it from coming back. I guess the only way you would know, if your basement's finished, you can't really tell. Now, you've probably seen it if you're in newer houses, there are plastic covers in the basement. There's lots of them usually.
Yeah.
They're usually, when they're near the outside wall, where the water is leaving the house, those are cleanouts. So if you had a diaper that got flushed down the toilet, got stuck between you and the street, that's where the plumber comes in, he takes that out, he digs down, finds the end of the cleanout, which would look like this, only bigger. He takes the end off, he goes in and pushes whatever's in there out in the street, and that's what those are for. But if you have a bathroom, there's going to be, if a full bathroom, a bathtub or a shower, and then you have a toilet and a sink, all of those go together, go into a main pipe, they go through one of these. There's a check valve there, so it protects that room, but it doesn't protect the floor drain or anything else. And they can't use this type on the main sewer because the city is using your pipe to vent the main sewer line. So that's why it has to be a floating vent on the way out. And I've got some pictures of those. I think it's next year, actually. That's what it looks like. It's just a black box on the floor. It's about 1 foot long, 10 inches wide. And there's a screw on that. Once you undo the screw, that's what they look like inside, if you can see it. And you are supposed to service these once a year. And that makes a lot of sense to me, although I'm not very squeamish, but I don't think I'd really like to do that once a year. When sewage goes over that, paper and that sort of thing can get in. They're kind of built so it doesn't, but it will. And it will eventually, I think, I know, if you don't service it, clean it, wash it out, it will get stuck. So if you have your sewer back up, it may not come up. So if you got one of those, you should leave access to it. And at least every couple of years, go in and make sure that the float still works. And it's quite a little job. There's a dozen screws on that, pull it apart. And that's, I don't know if you can see it, when the yellow piece is down, it's allowing the sewage to go through, and when it's up, that would prevent the sewage from coming back. Sumps. Now, a new thing has come up with sumps. And you probably, I don't know if anybody's heard anything about radon gas in the last little while. The Alberta government, and especially the federal government, is really starting to push the need to be careful with radon gas. It's, after smoking, it's the second leading cause of lung cancer in Canada. And new houses now have to have radon gas remediation systems in place. Rough-ins, they don't have to be installed, they just have to, and what it basically is a weeping tile system around the inside of your house, under the slab in the basement, tied to a pipe that goes up into the attic, doesn't even have to go outside. I think they should have made it go right outside because it would work even as a collection system, but that's all it has to be. And if it's found that you have a radon problem, you put a fan on that, and you take it out through the roof, and you turn the fan on, and you never turn it off again. It collects the gas that's underneath, air and gas that's underneath the slab, and vents it to the roof where the isotopes can disperse. They're also requiring plastic underneath your concrete now to help prevent that gas from coming through. It's going to be sealed around the floor drains, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the past, whenever we've had hydrostatic pressure, which is water coming up from the ground, the first thing you do is you correct your surface drainage, you get your downspouts and outspouts away so you don't compound the problem by adding surface water. Then you put in a sump. And even if it's just a sump that you dig into the ground and garbage can with holes in it, plastic buckets, I've seen all kinds of things used, wood. The water will find its way in the gravel that's underneath your slab, find its way to that pit where you can pump it out, reduces the pressure against the bottom of your house. It works pretty good, and in some cases that's what you need to do to stop water from coming up into your basement. And the worst scenario is in an infill houses, they put the weeping tower on the outside, run it through the inside into a sump, and that's a requirement because they don't have storm collection in the older neighborhoods. What you've made is not only a sump, but a collection for radon gas. So now with the sumps, this type is just a bucket in the ground. Now you've introduced a very good place for radon gas to come into the house. So in the last year or so, I've been recommending on these to put an airtight cover on them. Consider an exhaust system off of that. Not only is it now a sump, it's also a radon extraction point. Yes?
Is it radioactive?
It is. It's radioactive. It's from the breakdown of I think it's natural materials. And as it breaks apart, the isotopes are released into the air as it comes out of the ground. So once it gets into the regular air, it breaks apart. And it used to be 800 becquerels is what the rating was. And years ago when we had lots of people coming from the States, part of their package of being relocated was a radon test. And I used to do lots of tests, and quite often they'd come back at 300 or 400 becquerels. But it didn't matter because our rate was high, and so everybody said that's okay. But now it's down to 200. And so we do have some houses in Calgary that are higher than the national recommended amount. And then there's ways to remediate that. And what I've just said is one of them. Yes?
How can you
tell? You can go down to Home Depot and you can buy a radon test kit, and you want it at least 3 months, better 6 months, best 1 year. And you put them where you live, and when you buy them, they're $40. And when you're done, you send it in. You have to record when you started and when you ended. You send it in, and they'll tell you what you've been exposed to over that time. You can get them for 3 days, but they're usually wrong. They're either really high or really low.
Because I bought a new house, so
Yes.
this thing is in my garage. I don't have a basement. And when we took over the house, the guy told me, because they're all in the same area, the water tank, the furnace, and the radium thing. He said, you know what, don't come to this room. I was like, why?
Oh, that's ridiculous. It's not that bad. It's like going into a room filled with smoke, cigarette smoke. I mean, it's not good for you, but it isn't going to kill you, unless you're doing it every day for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It sounds like they have a remediation for radon built in. If it's a brand new house, it's supposed to be there. But that's going to be all sealed. And even up in the attic, there'll be a cap on it. So that won't be introducing anything in there. It shouldn't be.
Because for 2 days I couldn't sleep. I was like, I'm living.
Yeah, I know. Right? That happens to me too. I got to be very careful when I'm doing home inspections. Even if I say, oh man, people go nuts.
Yeah.
And it might not be that big a deal, so I try very hard not to do that. Anything could be fixed. Everything could be
I
fixed.
called Ray. I said, Ray,
What do I do?
I bought the house. I can't live there.
I'm losing my hair. Poor guy. It's an issue because that's why I'm talking about it. So if I saw this today, I would say I would recommend you put a sealed surface on this and ventilate it for radon gas. And it's only because I'm becoming more aware of it. I used to say, don't worry about it, open the window. And I can't do that anymore because I've learned enough now to know that there is an issue, and it's becoming more and more, we're becoming more and more aware of it because of the research that's being done. And there has been, there's a research project, or I think they've just about finished at the University of Calgary, where they're trying to get an idea where the hot spots are. Years ago, we'd seen it out in the States. They've been doing these tests for years.
And at the Canadian border, there was nothing above it. I said, well, we're okay. But it would show in red and blue and orange and all different amounts. And down east, much higher, but we still have radon just like we have termites. Not much, but we have termites. Not as close as Lethbridge, believe it or not. Another problem. This is exactly what I'm talking about. That's actually, if you can see it, this is what it looks like. It's just a PVC pipe coming out of the floor, and where this junction is here, that's where you would put the pump. The only other thing you'd have to do is take it up through the roof. That's why I think it would go through the roof.
And if it's only in this room?
It's connected to a whole bunch of pipes under your house.
Oh, okay.
And those pipes are designed, they're weeping tiles, is all they are. So they're designed, if you start sucking with a fan, it's gonna pull the air that's around it, which has the radon in it, and dump it out onto the roof. And there's radon is coming up everywhere. It's just that we've decided to build a house, and now it comes up inside the house and it's not dispersing like it was when they used teepees. Teepees were the best thing. Lots of air in, lots of air out. Yes?
So if you don't have a smoke pump, and you want to get rid of the radon out of your home, who do you hire to do that?
Well, there's lots of companies coming out of the woodwork now that do exactly that. And what they will probably do is a sump. And if you don't want to spend too much money, because it's doing the same thing. If it's sealed and you put a fan on it, underneath when they build a house, they dig down for the footing, and then they build the concrete above that, and from the bottom of the footing to the top of the footing through the entire basement is filled up with crushed gravel. And then the slab sits on top of that. So you have anywhere from 6 to 8 inches of crushed gravel underneath your slab. Now air can move through that fairly easily, and if you take it from a central point and vent it out, you're going to collect the majority of it. Now, if it's really bad, then you got to dig out your concrete all around the inside and put that grid work in and bring those into that. It doesn't have to be a pit, it can just be a pipe, and then that's what they do with this one. Takes the pipe and vents it outside. So everything underneath is perforated, everything above is not.
There's new companies that just do this.
Yes, there is. And we can buy a machine that actually can do a 3-day test. But from the people that I've talked to that have actually got them and started, they say they can go and do one test and it'll be very high. They go back and it's very low. You know, it's over 3 days. So it kind of depends on what happens in those 3 days. That's why a longer test is more accurate as to what you're actually being exposed to. So when our kids were young, my wife and I we have a bi-level, and we took the basement over as our level. And we would stay down for almost 10 years, and that's where your radon is going to be higher. So that's probably not a bad thing to kind of test, but whatever. Oh, that last one shows what they do at the end. It's just capped off in the attic. Is what they do now. And this one here is exactly what I'm just talking about. This one is a sump and a radon extraction at the same time. Okay.
So when it's happening off in the attic, then doesn't that tube just?
It doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
It's doing nothing. It's a bunch of money that they spent that doesn't do a darn thing. If you took it up and let it go through the attic, at least there may be some air movement, I would think, but maybe not, because there's no real pressure underneath the slab. There's no reason for the air under the slab to come out. So you pretty much have to have, I guess you really wouldn't do much without a fan on it. But if you have to put a fan on, now you got to bring a roofer in to put a new vent on the roof, and then you got to get a plumber to put the pipe in, and now you're hiring 3 different guys to do what it would just take to put a fan in. Anyway, just me using a little logic. This is something that may have happened to some of you before. When a toilet is put down and connected to your sewer, majority of their sewers in the last 30 years, 35 years has been plastic. But it's still plastic to porcelain, and they don't go together very well. So they use a ring, it's a beeswax ring that they put on the bottom of the toilet, and when they push it and fasten the toilet down, that ring creates a seal. They don't last forever. And I don't know if you won't be able to see it, but there's a little tiny flash from my flash, and there's water coming out from underneath this toilet every time you flush it. You're lucky if it comes out on the top.
Usually what happens is it comes out, goes underneath the floor and starts to rot out your K3 if it's underneath, which most of them is, and below that is your subfloor, which could be OSB or even plywood. And in the worst case, I've seen it actually starting to take out the structure, the actual joists, and you don't even know it's happening. So look very careful around the base of your toilets. If you happen to see water there unexpectedly and it continually comes, it is well worth getting a plumber to come in and have a look at it. They need a moisture meter. This is probably the most important piece of equipment that I use. What it can do is it sends out, there's two ways it works. One is the search mode, and when I put it around the base of a toilet or on a shower enclosure, it works on density. It sends out a radio wave, and depending on how it bounces back, it can tell if there's more density there or not. So next to a toilet, if it's wet, it will tell me. In a shower, it will also tell if there's water behind the tile. It will show that up as well. The other mesh is this one, 2 prongs here. Put it on that mode. When you put it in, it will give you the relative humidity of whatever you put it into. And if a realtor gives me a lot of trouble, ask me. No, not really. Electrical. We're going to do a couple more and then we'll take
So
it.
what do you call this?
This is a moisture meter. They're really cheap now. I think these are down to $400. I paid $7 for this, but you can see it's well used. You can get cheaper ones actually. I think I've seen them for $150. That wouldn't last for a professional, but if you're only using it occasionally, it would. It works on the same technology, but they might have plastic or rubber on the back. It would rub off and leak. What I did. This one's straight through. It's a sensor on this one. Anyway. Electrical. There's not a lot to do on panels, but there is a few things. And anybody live in a house that's less than a year old? No, you do. So there's one thing that's changed quite a bit, and it's called an arc fault circuit interrupter system. And that's this breaker. And on your house, you depending when it was built, you could have up to about 15 of these in your breaker, in your panel. It's only come in this year, so if a permit was taken out before this was a requirement, you will only have 3 or 2 maybe of these. When they first came out, these are designed to reduce the chance of fires in houses. When they first came out, they were required in bedrooms only. And what they do is on each, you have 2 phases in a house, or 2 lines coming in. Each one follows a specific wave if you look at it on an oscilloscope. These devices monitor that wave, and if there's a disruption in it, it recognizes it as an arc and immediately trips off. So they were designed, if you have a clock radio on the side of the bed, it falls off, starts sparking and arcing. If it goes over 15 amp, the breaker would take it out. If it's less than that, it can still be hot enough to melt metal and start a fire, and it would recognize that and trip off. Now that came in about 2009, so if you have a house between now and then, you will have at least 2 of these, one for the master bedroom, one for the other 2 bedrooms. If you do a basement, whether you have a bathroom or a bedroom or not, every non-designated circuit has to have one of these. And they don't want them going through lights, so now houses have to be wired completely different. So you can't just put them in your house either. When you have them, they need to be tested. They're supposed to be tested monthly. You push the test button, they will trip off part way. You turn them the rest of the way off and back on again. Now that's ridiculous to expect somebody to do it once a month. And that's what companies do because they know nobody will do it. And if you have a complaint, they say, did you test it every month? You got to lie or do it, or they won't replace it, in my opinion. Anyway, twice a year is probably enough when you change your clock radios. You've got to change them anyway, and as well test them. The exempts are designated circuit generally. So that would be sumps, refrigerators, deep freezes, there's a couple other ones, but you can't have them on smoke detectors. They cannot be on those. So if you're developing a basement, you'll be spending extra money because of those. And they should be tested. Now, what's been around a lot longer, and you guys have probably seen them, test reset button in your bathrooms. They have been around since 1977, and Originally, when they came out, they looked very similar to these ones, but they do the same thing. Your power goes back and forth 60 times every second, and these devices monitor that. If you plug in 2.35 amps of something, an outside lawnmower, hair dryer, whatever it is, as long as it's equal going both ways, it's happy. And it doesn't care if it even goes over 15 amps. It will stay even. The 15 amp breaker would work the same on this, and it would protect this one in your bathrooms if it goes over 15. But if it's more than 0.5 milliamp goes to ground, it recognizes that it's no longer a balanced system, and within a 40th of a second it trips off. So if you drop a hair dryer into a sink in the bathroom, before it gets to the bottom of the sink, the power's out. Once a month, you push the test button, it trips part way off, turn it all the way off, and then back on again. And on these ones in your bathroom, once a month, it says right on it, once a month. Everybody does it? Yeah, nobody does that. But it is important. I find lots of these that do not trip. If they don't trip, you're not protected.
So how do you test this one?
It's got a test button,
Yeah.
push the red button. It won't test with no power going through it.
Yeah.
But you push the test button, it should click. You push the reset, it should click. And if you want to plug something in, the power should go off when it clicks and come back on. If it doesn't go off, I see that they wired it wrong. So that's a good way to do it. I use a tester when I'm doing it. But if you just plug something in, when you push the test button, the power should go out. Push the reset, it should come back on. If it doesn't trip off and it doesn't reset, you need a new one. Okay? Very important. When these first came out, they were in full bathrooms only, not even half bathrooms. Outside outlets, whirlpool tubs, swimming pool rooms, hot tub equipment, etc. Now they're required, if you have a sink with an outlet within 5 feet, you need a ground fault on it. So what they used to do in kitchens is they used to do a split plug. Top and bottom of each outlet was on 2 separate circuits, so you plug a toaster tea kettle in without tripping the breaker. Now they need a ground fault. So if you have a split plugs, you can buy a 2-pole ground fault. It's like this one, but it's got 2 poles on it, so both phase. In new houses, what they've got is they take a single 20 amp outlet out, and they put a 20 amp ground fault on there. So now 20 amp gives you the ability to plug the toaster tea kettle in, single phase, and you've got a ground fault on it. So those outlets will have a little T on them. I don't have one here, but on the neutral, when it's happy phase, on the neutral there will be a T on there. Okay? And that should indicate a 20 amp. Again, tested once a month.
Darcy?
Yes.
Sorry, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
In our house, will one of those be connected to, like, it's in our kids' bathroom?
Yes.
And then our ensuite, if that one trips,
Yes.
it can go to another bathroom? Or?
Remember when I said if you trip it and it doesn't go out?
Yeah.
Where this yellow is on here, that's called the load side. And that would be downstream from this one. So what's happening on yours is the line coming in goes into the bottom, depending on which way you call up and down, would go onto the bottom part. And here's another thing to know. There's copper and silver. Remember, dark to dark, light to light. So the black wire goes to the copper. The white wire goes to the silver. If you do it backwards, it can mess things up. Called reverse polarity. The line goes onto this one. The load comes off of this one. That means this is protected and whatever's downstream is protected. So in that case, there can be up to 11 outlets on that.
Okay.
But it's very common to see one in the master bedroom or main bath, looks after the master and the main floor half bath. And one on the front or one on the back looks after the one in the front on the outside plug-ins. So just because it's got a regular outlet doesn't mean it isn't ground faulted. And the only way you can test it by turning it off and then going back to see if this one's off, turn it on, make sure it comes on. Or you can buy a little tester, they're about $25. You plug it in, you push the test button, and it takes 7 milliamps of power to ground, and it should trip off. That's what I do every day. And I wear them out. It takes me about 3 years to wear them out. So, excuse me. Anyway, that's about the only things in a panel. Arc fault, ground fault. Are about the only things you need to really watch. It's not a bad idea to have, depending on the age of your house, just because there's a city sticker and they're not even putting city stickers on anymore, doesn't mean it's done right. It's part of the reason I've got a job, because Lots of things don't get done right. I don't wanna scare you, but electrical is one of those important things that should be done right. If you have any problems with anything, you get a light that's flickering and keeps burning out on you, or a light outlet that's warm, or a switch that seems to be warm. Now, that's not anything that you use for dimmers, they always get warm. But if you see anything that's unusual like that, it's well worth to have an electrician come in and say, can you check this out for me while you're here, go through the panel. You can also call us, we'll do a checkup for you, but I'll stay away from that. There are certain things that you're not allowed to do, and that's one of them. You should not have an electrical panel over top of a sink. It should not be in a kitchen, it should not be in a closet. And the reason for that one is you wouldn't think that's a problem, but if you put stuff in your closet, you can't get at it in the case of an emergency. And I'm leery to work on these when you're going into high voltage and you're standing beside a sink that's grounded, or a laundry, or stairs, all kinds of things. That's one of the major problems. So GSCIs, ASCIs I've just talked about, and that's what they look like. Whoops, that's what the kitchen ones look like. And this is exactly what I just explained to her, was the one downstream is protected on the one that's upstream. So you can have up to, I don't know if you can see that one, but an electrician built this house.
Spare parts.
Smoke detectors. It's changed tremendously over the last few years as to what is required for smoke detectors. It used to be one within 10 feet of any bedroom. It's still that. Now it's also 10 feet from every bedroom, one on each floor, one inside every bedroom. Does yours have smoke detectors inside each bedroom? Yeah, so you're close to, you might have all the articles too. That's a relatively new requirement. They all have to be tied in together. So it's getting to the point where you can only have 12 units on there. Some of these bigger houses are going to have 2 circuits for just smoke detectors. They should be tested monthly by pushing the test button and making sure they come on and making sure that they're all tied together. And they should be replaced at 10 years. Now, carbon monoxide detectors have only been around for a few years. When they first came out, they were only about 7 years. They are now 10 years. And anything that you buy has, I don't have one here, has on it. I think this one has it on here and I can't read it, but it tells you it's good until, the date it's good until. And anything in the last 2 years, if it's new, will have that good until date on it. And I'm looking very much forward to when all the old ones are gone. Because I'm guessing all the time when I look at them how old they are. I just usually tell people to change them so you know. On all the new houses, they're tied together. Older houses, they're not going to be tied together. The best you can do without rewiring is now you can buy groupings of smoke detectors that are radio wave connected. So if one goes off, it sends a signal to the other one. And they are also combination smoke carbon monoxide. I would highly recommend one on each level, however you do it. Okay? And test them regularly.
Carbon monoxide heavier than air?
Slightly. It doesn't matter though. A lot of people say they should be down near the floor, and technically that is the best place for them. But the way they work, they put a little spark across the filament, and the way that it reacts with carbon monoxide, it tells it that it's above a certain level, and that level is somewhere between 40 and 60 parts per million. And I don't have my CO detector in here. Mine starts at 5 parts per million. And when you're working in an area, you're allowed as an adult male, I think it's 70 parts per million for 8 hours. And I've gone into warehouses where they're running around with those little gas forklifts and read over 100 parts per million with my CO detector. It's not good for you, but these ones, the CO detectors, they do that marking for, say it's 40 to 50 parts per million. It does it every 2 minutes, and it has to be 3 consecutive minutes over that amount before it alarms. So if it's that high, it's not a cigarette, it's not a cracked heat exchanger, it's probably a car that's running in the garage with the door open between the house and the garage. We're talking tons of carbon monoxide, and whether it's at the bottom sensing it or up at the top, it's gonna go off. So that's the reason it doesn't really matter, because we're talking high levels of carbon monoxide, not just somebody smoking in your living room. And when you put it in, by the way, when you put it into the stream of a cigarette, or you go, it's like 200 parts per million of carbon monoxide coming out of that. So if you're a smoker, that's another reason not to. You know, garage car doors, they really need to be serviced once a year, but once a month, you should be looking at them. And when you push the button on these, don't let any kids around while you're doing this, but you run over to it or have somebody help you. There should be a beam across the bottom, and when you put your foot through the beam and break that beam, the door should stop and go back up. That's a pretty simple test. The next one can be a little trickier. Don't be a gorilla, but push the button, go over to the door, and grab it. It should return under 10 pounds of pressure. So just do like that. If it doesn't stop, it needs to be adjusted. And there's a simple adjustment on the side or the back or inside, and you just go less on it. Now you can get it so less that when it gets a little jumpy, it starts going back up. That's too little. So you got to kind of play with it a little bit. But it's important. I showed my son this, and he managed to get his truck hood over, and the door came down, and it exploded the door. It didn't hurt his truck, but it exploded his door into 100 pieces. And it's just a simple adjustment. The springs on the top of these, the other thing you should do is take the door, disconnect it from the opener. And let's see if I can show you on the last one here. You can kind of see it. There's usually a red string on the bottom. That's how you disconnect it. So the test would be the infrared on the bottom. The other one is the pressure. The third one is to loosen it off of the door. Let your door halfway up and down. It should balance wherever you put it, but halfway down, you let it go, it should stay there. If it drops, the spring needs to be adjusted. The spring balances that door, and over time, just like an elastic, it loses some of its strength, so it needs to be adjusted up. And I would highly recommend you do not do this unless you know how to do it, because it will take off the appendages. These weigh over 200 pounds, and there's lots of spring tension. What can happen on these is the springs can break, and if they break, it is like a shotgun going off, and the door becomes twice as heavy as you are. Well, this is only carrying half of the door, so the door will almost not open at all. That shows the infrared beam on the bottom. Unless you've got a really old one, that would be something that would be automatically on. They can't buy openers without those now. That's more than halfway through. You guys want to take a break? Do you want to punch through? Or do you want to ask some questions? Yeah.
The spring for the garage door,
Yes.
is there a preventive maintenance you can do on it?
No.
Should you really wait till it breaks to change it or not? Like, I mean,
If you talk to a door guy, they're going to say 10 years on those. Okay, if it's over 10 years, the risk goes up. Now that's based on going up and down 4 times a day. So 2 people going in and out twice a day. And that's pretty accurate from what I've seen. If I'm in a house that's 15 years old, either the spring is not working very well or it's been replaced. Because you can only tighten it so much. And if it's 12 years old, they come and adjust it up, they're going to say, I recommend you replace this rather than adjust it. Because it will probably crack. Remember. You guys want to keep going? Or do you want to take a break?
Generally, for those springs, I had to replace my springs in the house now. Those springs generally just go, I guess they're going to go right, doors going up, it's going to drop.
They'll go just all of a sudden. They just bang.
Yeah.
And but usually, if they're under pressure, I would guess, just using logic, the highest risk is when they're going down.
Yeah.
Because when they're coming up, the pressure is being released on them.
Oh, okay.
When it's going down, the pressure is going up on it. So, you know, it's sooner or later it's going to say this is too much, and they look like that one. They just crack right into it. Now that's a typical one. There's some newer ones that have the cam, the spring is inside,
Okay.
and those are a little more difficult to replace, but it's the same idea. Yeah. So after 10 years,
Just replace it.
you know, if you're using it a lot, some people go in and out 10 times during the day. Well, probably in 10 years it may have already been replaced. I've got a garage that I keep my motorcycles in, and hardly ever open up that garage, so that garage door opener is about 35 years old. It's an old Stanley, it still works, but one of these days I'll change it.
What
So-
about the motor? The motor for the garage door opener, do you?
A quarter horsepower is plenty. If that spring is set correctly, you should be able to take it with 2 fingers and lift it up and let it go wherever you want, and it should stay there. You don't need a great big motor on that. It needs to be adjusted properly, and it doesn't take hardly any pressure or any power to lift the door. If the door is struggling, there's something wrong with the spring or the door itself, probably the spring. Okay, so it's important to pull it off and see how that door is working. I've taken them off, just about pulls me over because there's nothing there. A poor old door opener is working like crazy to lift it. The spring and everything's pulling like crazy. That's wrong. And the door opener isn't going to reverse properly. It will, but it's not working the way it's designed.
So if you hear it too noisy, that's not a good sign?
Well, noisy can be that. It can also be just that, it's rusted a little bit, or sometimes the nuts on them that hold the door together, they quite often will loosen off. Not so much on the new ones, but on the old wood doors, they were notorious for coming off and loosening up just because expansion and contraction of wood. The metal ones are a little more stable, although they expand and contract too, but differently.
So are there shops who check it
Garage
for you?
car doors, yeah, you bet. Yeah, there's lots of them out there. Glenmore Door is my favorite because they helped me out one time. Don't mind saying their name. On that one door that I just talked about, they came and changed the spring for me. And they did it very quickly and I didn't need it.
Then door?
Glenmore Doors, but there's lots of them. Calgary Door, just Google them, you'll see. Probably a dozen of them now. I think we'll just carry on. Feel free to get up if you want. Structures, I said this earlier, this one you can't really see very well, but it's an older house and they got all kinds of things holding up this old house. They work, even though they're not correct. But I see things done incorrectly all the time. I don't know, you can't really see it with the garage car door. They wanted to put an opener in it. They didn't think to go down and get a low headroom opener. They bought one and said, well, the only way this is going to work is if I cut all these joists out of the way. So they cut 6 of the first 7 trusses right off. And a truss, if it is designed, it's only 2x4s, but they can span a long distance because of the way they distribute their weight. When you take the bottom cord out, that's just a 2x4 on the top. So you put a snow load on this, roof could literally come down on it. I see people doing stuff like this every day, and don't do it. If you don't know, I'd be happy to take the call. Call my office. You can ask Darcy a question. I'm happy to answer questions. Just don't do anything stupid if you can help. If they're open in the basement, much easier for me to look at them. After that, I have to use clues. And with new construction, the way these joists are made, these are truss joists, which anything in the last 20 years is a truss joist. They look like an I-beam, and they can span a long distance, but they are also very much like a piano string. They're very taut, and they don't transfer loads very well. If you put a load on the end, they can just crush. So there has to be a way of transferring the load from the upper levels to the lower levels. They usually put a 2x6 beside each one if there's a wall above it. Something I can't always see during an inspection, but there will be sometimes signs on things that are wrong. And this one here, it looks not too bad, but the main beam, they took a piece out here, put another piece in, they put a different piece over here. On the other side, it was all developed, it looked just perfect, but this system works, but it's not, the upstairs was just like rolling hills of tree hills. On this one here, you're not going to be able to see it, but there's a significant crack right across here. That is not normal. And this one had a crawl space underneath it, and they had actually taken out a section of the beam that was supporting this wall. It was a fairly simple fix, but it was actually a realtor asked me to come and figure out what was wrong with his house, and it was this section of wall that had been taken out. Now, this is something that's happened it's been really bad in the last 4 or 5 years. And when you go into these new areas, you see all these houses, they're nice and pretty now. You got pink and green and orange and purple outside sheeting before the siding goes on the outside. You guys seen that? That is a new requirement for what's called flame protection. And we've all heard, oh, there's a house up in the Citadel or wherever. It burned down and 2 houses beside it burned down because they're so close together, and we decided to put vinyl on the outside, which is just like having gasoline on the outside of your house. They say, well, this is no good, so we've got to stop this. So now that the material that you're seeing on the sheathing is fire resistant. So that if it catches on fire, it's not like OSB. It takes more for that to burn. When you put the siding on there, they want the softening, which is when you have your roof covered, part of the roof comes out, and before it ends past the building, that softening on these side yards is no longer allowed to have vents in it. And the idea is that if there's a fire, it's not going to go through the tiny holes in the vents and get up into the attic. Well, that's really good for the firemen. But those holes in the soffits are very important to allow air to get up into the attic. And it has to come out in at one side, down near the bottom, and go out near the top where it doesn't vent very well. So since they've come up with this new requirement, they have, it's resulted in, not only is it less ventilation, but the houses now are so tight. I talked about this earlier. They're putting vapor barriers in, which they've had for a long time, and now they're really sealing them tightly. The windows are tighter. The house is tighter. The furnaces are tighter. The fireplaces, they don't even allow air in and out on those. So your house is becoming very much a balloon. So when you have a very small opening, which is the biggest one in your house, is the attic hatch. If it's not sealed really well, and that stack effect I was talking about earlier, air coming down from the bottom trying to get up into the attic, a small hole can result in, nowadays, moisture building up on the underside of the sheathing in the attic. And I've seen it like an inch thick. And when it warms up, they've got a name for it. It's so common. It's called attic rain. And it's a real problem in new houses. I go into a 100-year-old house, there's no vapor barrier, no vents. There's an inch of insulation and not a spot of frost anywhere because it vents so well. Terribly inefficient, but they don't have any problems. And on these houses that they're having these issues with, they're going back and they're having to put vents down near the bottom. And now you'll see it in the new houses where on the bottom of the roof, where they used to allow it to come in from the soffit, they're now putting roof vents in there. And then roof vents on the top. Problem with ones on the bottom is it's blowing the insulation away. So there's all kinds of issues coming up with this. But it's getting a little bit better. This is another thing that kind of, when they change things over, it has to work through a little bit. Surface drainage is the absolute most difficult, or most common problem I find with houses. And the reason is when they build a house, they dig a hole big enough for the house. This is what I was talking about earlier. They dig it down to the bottom of the footings. They put the house into place. They backfill it with the dirt that came out. And they may put it in, they may even bring it up a little bit. And then they build the house. And within usually 6 months, if it's a typical house, they're going to come in and they're going to start finishing everything. They'll grade it again, and then they'll put 6 inches of dirt on top of it. Now, in the next 5 years, that dirt that's just been pushed into here begins to consolidate back down to its original density, or close to its original density. So the dirt next to the house drops. Just about every house I look at has ground sloping back towards the house. So now when you get rain, the water that hits the house, if it's not leaking into the house, will come down and be right beside the foundation. And everything around the house within 4 feet is going to also end up next to the foundation wall. Well then, it's going to try and go down the outside of the foundation wall. The weeping tile, if it's there, is not designed to pick up water from the surface. It's designed to bring water from the bottom. If you start getting water from the surface, it will bring dirt and silt with it and will eventually flood those up. So it's really, really important, whether you have weeping tile or not, you need to have the ground sloping the right way. And it's very important, it's the very most common problem. The best thing around a house, 4 feet all the way around, is concrete at a 2% slope. That's great. I've only seen a very few houses like that. I've only seen maybe 1 in 200 where the drainage around the house is good, all the way around. It doesn't mean your basement will leak, it just means the less surface drainage, proper surface drainage you got, and the worse it is, the higher the risk is that the basement's going to leak. Okay?
So the surface drainage, how far should it be away from the house?
6 feet. The leaders, these,
Yeah.
6 feet, because generally they go 4 feet past the house to put in the house, to actually put in the foundation. So if you go past that, the chances are, now 4 feet is probably enough, and even 3 feet is enough if the drainage is good. But if you want to get back onto undisturbed soil, you got to go 6 feet away. And the further the better, really. I have no problem if you go over to your fence and run it down to the lane. I love that. But sometimes that'll freeze in the winter too, so that could be a different problem.
It's
Weeping
supposed to be
tile,
house.
does that hook up to the storm?
It is the storm, which is the same water that's collected on the street, separate from the sanitary. But if you have weeping tile without a sump, that's where it goes. 2 separate lines coming from the house up to the street. They get mixed up once in a while. That means sewage into the storm. Even a house where you got, there's houses where the back is way higher than the front. You can still do a proper weeping tile, or a swaling around the house. It's coming down, you still have to go from the house out, down, the two are going to meet, then you make what's called a swale. And it can be done very nicely, and it does work, but it has to be done, or should be done, so you keep the water away from your house. You might even recognize this. This is the Hawkwood Baptist Church, or whatever the church is. They're just on Deerfoot. This one here had a problem with water coming around the corner. Their air conditioners are here, but there's windows down there, and the water was coming around getting trapped in there. The same building just around the corner is exactly what I was talking about. This is sloping this way, this is sloping this way, it works perfectly. So it can be done right, and in the same building it can be done wrong. Houses this one's up fairly high, but again, everything is kind of sloping towards these windows. And there's nothing worse than having an aquarium in a basement window. This one's really bad. You've got water coming off the roof, coming straight into there. So, in a normal rain, it's not going to be too much of a problem. But in a heavy rain, the June monsoon season, you get rain day after day after day after day, and then you get 2 inches. The ground is saturated, it can't hold anymore, and the water's just running on the surface, and that's when you get basement leakages. And good fumes. Same thing on this one. Huge amount of slope away from the house. But you can see that the ground here, the sidewalk settled. The distance between the step here is now about 10 or 12 inches. That's a trip hazard, but it's all because the ground is sloped, it's settled down. It's also sloping back toward the house. So just because you're up high doesn't mean your drainage is right. And this can be the result. That's mold in behind the wall that's gotten saturated. Roofing. When you start seeing the edges of your roof starting to lift, now I'm guessing most of you have got houses that are less than probably 10 or 15 years old. Is there anybody with a house older than that here? Yep. 15 years? Okay. That's when they started using composite fiberglass shingles. So they don't react like these old asphalt ones. These curl up, they almost touch each other. They curl up so much. The new ones will do that, and usually at 15 years, I can pretty much tell when a roof is close to 10 years old, because the bottom edges are starting to curl down into the eave troughs. At 12 to 15 years, the edges start lifting up. And after that, very quickly, nowadays they curl up and kind of make almost like a little claw on the edges. It's only a matter of time, and you want to change that the day before it leaks. And it's getting close. Okay? Ventilation, this one here, it's hard to see, but these are very well worn. and you get up to here and they stop. They're actually not in bad shape up here. But right there's a vent. So at the top, it's being ventilated better than at the bottom. And these are black, so the heat, I've been told it doesn't make any difference, but this is obvious to me. I see it all the time. If you have better ventilation, they last longer.
So if you have cedar or pine shit.
Yeah. It's similar. They wear differently. If it's cedar, what will happen on those? They're cut, or they're split.
Yeah.
So if you walk on them, you can split them more. And the way they do it is cedar shake, it's wide at the bottom, narrow at the, even the pine is the same, it's just a different material. When they put each layer down, the distance between them is about the thickness of my finger, 3/8 of an inch is what should be between them. Then when they put the next layer on top, the offset can't be less than 1.5 inches. Now, when they put the first layer down, they come up, they're 24 inches, so they come up 20 inches and they put a layer of felt on there. Then they come up 10 inches and they put the next layer, and at 20 inches they put an 18-inch felt there. So the felt is actually, any water that gets past the shakes hits the felts and comes back out onto the shake. Now with cedar, if you get a joint and then below it gets cracked, and then it gets cracked below it, or there's another joint, now the water is running down the felts, and the felts will wear out and you'll get a leak. So what they do, they either replace the broken ones, and that's when you get the checkerboard roof finish, or they will come in with a shim, which is like this, and they put it up underneath the broken one, and the water hits the shim and comes back out. So there's ways to manage that. Pine shakes, they tend to curl, and they do more of the kind of the ski jumps, and they usually have to replace those. Pine shakes, before they were treated, were non-treated, and there's not many of those left. That was back in the 80s and into the 90s. I think 96 was the last they put them in. So that's 20 years ago. So there's still a few of them around, but they're pretty much rotten right off the roof. The pine shakes that are treated seem to be doing much better. But they still, when you start seeing black ones on there, that's starting to rot. So they can do tune-ups, and they'll do a 5-year guarantee or a 10-year guarantee, and the price reflects how many shakes they replace.
So like if they say 5-year warranty, what you said.
Yeah.
So they don't need to check it annually?
No, well, no, I wouldn't. If you do, then I'd be really looking at changing it. It's that bad. You know, they can tell which ones are going to rot out in the next 5 years. And all that warranty is that they'll come and fix the ones that rot out. That's all. It doesn't mean they're going to fix your house if it leaks. Just the cover is all that warranty. They're good. They're good people. They do a good job. But in a lot of the areas now, even though there's a restricted covenant on the house, which says it has to be wood or better, you go into a lot of the areas and they just are starting to change to asphalt or composite shingles. And over in Valley Ridge and out in Douglasdale, they're pretty much given up on the pine, and everybody's going to asphalt. But theoretically, somebody could say, I want these to be wood or better, and the restricted covenant on it says it has to be. But you just got to go with kind of what's going on in the neighborhood. Hamptons is one of the slowest ones because they were pretty regimented up there. It had to be this and only this. But
We're supposed to be an architecturally controlled
that's
neighborhood.
what it's all about, and that's why it's a restricted covenant. But in my opinion, a good quality architectural asphalt composite shingle is better than a wood shake. In my opinion, it doesn't look the same, but
For durability is better.
way better for maintenance, durability, longevity. It's the way to go, in my opinion.
What about the red bricks, whatever they...
Well, yeah, the concrete tile is very, very good. Most of the time, there's very little problem with them, although I have seen problems with them spalling and breaking apart. Unfortunately, Unicrete is gone. A couple of years ago, they were bought, they tore the building down and put something else there. So they used to be, they were for 20, 30 years, they were manufactured right in town. Now they have to either come from the States or down east, so they're not being used like they were before. And that was the curved ones and the flat ones, concrete ones. Yeah, they had a pretty neat, I went to their building for a tour a couple of miles, quite a few years ago now, but it was very interesting. but I can see why some of them are not as good as others, just the way it's a concrete, so it's the way it's mixed, the way it's cured, and even back then, they'd go through and they'd throw the odd one out, you know. And but I've seen a few where the surface is actually, the glazing has come apart and they're cracking and deteriorating. Anyway, I think I've got a picture of them here. When they were first put down, they did what's called single strapping. They put the felts down, they put a horizontal strip. There's still a bunch of those around, but water would get trapped in behind when they get below. Now they put a vertical strip and then a horizontal strip so the water can run through them. So that's one thing I would look on, one that's older than about 1988. Looking on roofs, it's really important to get up, and this was only a 2-year-old roof here, and I think it's right down here. There's actually a shingle that got blown off. Fortunately, there was a felt underneath it, so it wasn't leaking at this point, but that felt is not designed to resist the ultraviolet sunlight. So it's only a matter of time. So even if you got a fairly new roof, you don't have to get up on it. Now, the reason I'm walking around, I broke my heels 14 years ago. After about 2 hours of standing, my feet get a little antsy. But don't fall off a roof. If you're not comfortable, hire somebody to come and take a look at it. But you can get, even a few houses away with cameras now. You can take a picture and zoom right in to see if there's anything that looks unusual. But if you see any shingles that are loose, lifting, ripped, or missing, you need somebody to come and replace those. This one is damaged. This happens quite often on roofs that are over garages and you have a second floor. The siding guys, whoever they are, they have to get up to put the siding on. So they'll put something on the roof so they can climb up and do the siding. And often they're careful and they put a strip of wood on there and they put a couple of nails in it. And when they're done, they tab the nail holes. This one, they destroyed this roof. It's ripped right out, brand new house. And those shingles would have to be replaced. Little details. It's amazing how much water can go through a very small hole in the right circumstance. This is a fascia coming into a roof, so there was a second story on this. And right here there's a big hole, and the water just poured in there. These flashings have to come all the way down and overlap on the shingle, or water can go the wrong way. And all it takes is a little bit of wind, or just a wrong slope on the shingle. This one here is called a kick-out flashing, and this one was extenuated because they were having problems with it. When you have a wall or another roof or anything coming down onto a lower roof, where that roof ends, you can end up with water getting in behind everything. So all they've done is they put a piece of flashing in there to kick the water out to make sure it goes into the eave trough. So if you have any place that there's a wall and there's a roof that ends, you want to look at that point. Because not only can it get in under the fascia, it can also get in behind. And once it gets in behind, it can show up 2 floors down or in behind a piece of window on the floor. I've seen water get in very easily in some of these places, and it's a simple fix. This one here, this is called a storm collar. They had a chase coming up with a cap on the chase and the hole in there for the chimney. The chimney came up, and then they put it on this storm collar, and that storm collar is sealed to the chimney so that water hitting the chimney hits that, drains off the side. This has to be maintained, the caulking there, every 10 years or so. But this one, there's a hole right there, and the water was coming down and going right down into the chase, down into the basement. It was showing up in the basement on this one. Foundation cracks are very, very common. If it's less than a quarter, the size of a quarter, there's absolutely, I should say absolutely, it is very likely it's just a shrinkage crack, and it's structurally not an issue. I've even seen cracks getting upwards of a 2 that are still just shrinkage cracks. Structurally not an issue. The biggest problem with them is moisture going through them. If they're below grade, sometimes you have to bring in, they can inject into the concrete with that's an acrylic, or not an acrylic, it's an epoxy that they drill holes into the crack and they force it in under pressure, and it basically fills the crack up and stops it from leaking. Most of the ones I see are just typical shrinkage cracks, and the biggest worry on those is water getting through it. That one may look like it's pretty big, but the parging is cracked, and somebody's trying to fix it. The actual crack is minuscule on this one. So not a problem. The biggest thing here is it looks terrible, and you might want to clean up the parging and so that it can be concealed so you don't look at it. This one is out in Cochrane. Anybody here from Cochrane? It's a good place to live, but they do have some problems on the lower level, on the where Main Street is. The ground there is very much an expansive clay, and when it gets wet, it expands. So what was happening in this one is it actually pushed the floor up, and it was cracking all over the place, and it was like taking a height, go up, go back down. The only way you can get rid of that is you got to get rid of the water underneath. So you're almost removing the slab, putting a proper weeping towel system in to collect and control that moisture. This is a very old house. Unfortunately, it's gone now, but they had spent about $200,000 fixing up the inside of this house, and the foundation was literally breaking away on the outside. Most of this is because they didn't have eave troughs. When I looked at it, they still didn't have eave troughs on it. The water from the roof was coming down, hitting the ground, splashing up on the concrete. Even on your driveways, you'll get the surface starting to spall away, even on a very new slab. That's what this is, and an extreme long enough, it will take out the structure completely. So using a sealer, in this case, controlling the roof water getting away, surface drainage, back to what we were talking about, keeping the water away from your house. Caulking on the outside of the house is not the first line, well, it is the first line of defense. The best line of defense is the paper that they put on the house before they put any of the siding on. That is what keeps the water out of the house. The siding is what takes the brunt of the weather, and the caulking is just to help prevent water from getting into the paper. So you can't rely on it. But in this particular case, this was a bracket for a gas line. They didn't put any paper behind it, and when they push it in here, you're looking right at the OSB board. So any water that hits here is going right into the house. This was a brand new house. Hadn't been lived in yet. This is another one where they've used acrylic stucco, which is more common these days rather than the old sand cement. But again, in behind here, they didn't put any paper when they put this mechanical board box on there. And this is the other side. It was wet, completely wet on the other side. Big trouble. If this was open, if it was not open, I would not have been able to see that. And over time, by the time you figure out there's a problem, you'd be replacing, sheathing the structure. This one as well. Hard to see, but this is where a kickout flashing is important. All the way down here is black. And if you have really dark staining on stucco, especially the sand cement stucco, there's a problem. And the darker it is, the worse it is. They ended up pulling all the siding off of this house. It was a condo, actually. Keeping an eye on around doors and windows is important. A lot of us don't do that. It's a good idea, especially when it's really cold, to go around and look. If there's going to be any moisture, that's a good time to look for it, and when it's really raining, of course. And looking around the base, I apologize again, this one here, it's MDF, which is, if it gets wet, it just explodes. That's the good thing about it. It's what they use on trim on doors and baseboards and that sort of thing. What I like about it is it does explode, so if it has been wet, I can see it pretty easily, whereas regular wood, it's a lot harder to see staining and damage. But this one had been leaking through the door. This was onto the deck and had been leaking over the years. That's just an example of the way, because they're using vinyl windows and aluminum windows now, the amount of coverage that they have for the window, the flange that they fasten the windows into place with is all one piece from the end of the flange all the way around to the inside of the window. So there's no way water can get into it. And the windows that manufacturers, there's no way my window can leak. Well, you're trying to take building paper and fasten it to an 1.5 inch piece of vinyl so that the water can't get in around it. And that's what's happened for many, many years. The leaky condo syndrome in Vancouver, we have the same thing here. It's just taken many more years. And you see all these buildings, they're tearing off all the siding and redoing them. Same problems they had in Vancouver, it's just taken more years to get there because we have a more forgiving climate. But this is the way they have to do it now. They have to extend that flange at least 4 inches out so they don't leak. And that's what they've done on this one. This was done properly. This one's more common than you might think. Pigeons getting up underneath houses. I've seen where they get underneath, they pull the soffit away, they get right into the attic. They can make a mess. And their feces is very, very toxic. So it's not a good thing if they're in there. So you want to find out how they're getting in there, and then the only way, unfortunately, you get rid of this pigeon pie, but you're not supposed to do that. You got head up?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to say something?
Oh, I'm Ryan. I'm the office manager at HomeLife. So if you have any questions, we answer the call, and you can give me a message. I'll give it to Darcy. And our number is on all of our materials, but it's 403-295-3000. So if you have any questions, yeah, that's what we're here for.
We're slowly losing people, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have the inspection at 1:30. So I'm going to hold them.
Okay.
You can take some questions.
Yeah, I will do that.
Thanks.
Take
Take care, guys. Thanks a lot.
Squirrels can also get up in roofs quite easily. They need to watch that as well. What did I do with this one? Maintain your siding. Yeah. Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Keep a close eye on the outside of your building. Vinyl siding. I see this all the time. If you get a barbecue too close to it, by the time it's been too hot for too long, it's too late. You just melt it. And it can actually start a fire. This is very, very flammable. It will burn, and that's why fires jump from one house to another. Once it gets on fire, it's very flammable. Yep.
When you talk about stucco siding,
Yep.
are you gonna cover it or we're?
That's about all I've done, I think, on this one. But
I'm just wondering, how do you regularly maintain? You paint it?
stucco,
Yeah.
you don't really have to do anything to it. If there's, if it doesn't get damaged, it's okay, pretty much. If it gets a hole in it, then you need to patch the hole. The problem is with patching a hole is it's a texture, even if it's acrylic. So you can't feather out texture. You can feather out a wall, but you can't feather out texture. So if you're going to make it so you don't see it, whatever that plane is, you got to do the whole plane. So you'd have to do from that corner to that corner. And even then, you may not get the color exactly right. Unless they've done something wrong. Remember I was showing you the picture of the windows? If they've done that all correct, there's no reason that as long as the stucco is still on the wall without it cracking and falling off, it will last indefinitely, almost. But as soon as it gets damaged, or if it really gets cracked, there's probably another reason for it. Because the acrylic is actually a plastic, and it will expand and contract quite a bit, allowing for movement and cracking. But if it really opens up, there's probably a different problem that you have to address first, and then go back to the stucco. I like stucco. If it's done properly, it will last a very long time.
So do you recommend painting it once every?
I'm not a real, well, if it's acrylic, you can paint it with acrylic paint, and that's pretty easy. Now, if you've got sand cement stucco, I'm not a real fan of painting that. I would suggest if there's a problem, fix the problem, and then re-stucco over top of it. You can do that once, because then it gets too heavy after that.
Yeah.
So if you're going to change the color, I would recommend you stucco over it. After that, I've seen many that have been painted, and acrylic paint is very common these days. It's not as, it could create a problem on a wall that's worked well for 30 years or more, because it's not as permeable. Like the sand cement lime base is what most of the stucco is still today. They put the 2 layers of stucco on, and then they put the finish coat on top of it. So it's still being used, but that's very porous. Water just moves right through it. The acrylic is plastic, basically, and it's still porous and it's still permeable enough for moisture or for air to move back and forth. But if you've got a building that was built with the conventional stucco and you paint it, it may create a problem, and it's very expensive to put that on. So you put it on and you got a problem. Now what do?
it could be more difficult. Retaining walls, if you got them on your property, if they go more than half of the distance, the thickness of the wall, if it's more than half of that distance out of plumb, it's failed. And anything over 4 feet has to be engineered. Anything less than 4 feet, you can pretty much do whatever you want. But I suggest you go online. Nowadays, YouTube will show you just about everything you want to know. But be careful. You know, if it doesn't make sense, don't do it. You had a question? Or did I answer?
Oh, yeah, well, kind of. My father-in-law's got some stucco pillar under the deck. And you go, we saw a hole in the stucco below the.
Oh, okay. That is probably what's called ephes.
Okay.
So they put styrofoam underneath it.
All right.
And the woodpeckers, when they go up to it,
Okay, so it is.
it's hollow. And so they think hollow wood in the wild means it's rotten, and that means there's bugs in there. So the woodpeckers come, oh, well, this is good. They dig, 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 and make a hole, nothing there. They go back and they dig, 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 dig. My wife is the director at the University of Calgary Daycare at the West Campus, the main campus. And the whole outside of the building is covered. And every year she gets it patched, and every year they come back and it's the woodpeckers. They think there's wood. I've seen that in wood siding as well.
Okay.
Where they know that in the wintertime, if you take wood siding off in the winter, you'll find all the flies. That's where they winter. There's hundreds of thousands of them behind there, and the woodpeckers know that, and they take out the siding and get a meal. There's a good retaining wall, lots of good support, nice and straight. Built the defense onto it. Water meters, I've already talked a little bit about turning your water meter on and off. And in the wintertime, if you have the type of tap where you have to drain it, you have a shut-off, you need to know where that is, leave access to it. To turn it off, you simply turn this. When these ball cocks there's a ball inside on these. When the handle's in line with the pipe, it's open. When it's perpendicular, it's off. So you turn it off. This should be downstream, so that you go outside, open up your outside tap, let the pressure off. This one has a little screw on here. You undo the screw, and all the water that's in the pipe will drain out of it. Some of them will have a little nut on there that you do the same thing. And that's just to bleed it out so you don't have any water within, at the tap itself. Okay? That's really important. In the spring, you close the little valve, close the outside, open it up, and away you go again. But it's really important, and I think on this one here, this one's the water coming in, and this one's the outside taps where you turn them off. It's nice if, on the newer houses, that's usually what happens. It's usually right above the water main. Some of the older ones, it might be in a corner in the ceiling in the basement. So if that's where it is and you develop a basement, you got to know where that is.
Do you keep the outside water taps open?
I think it's a good idea to do that, because there's a rubber seal on those, on some of them. And if it's closed, it's okay if nobody touches it. But if it's closed and there's a little bit of moisture there and it's frozen, and you turn it, you could rip that seal apart. So just leave it open, and you can leave the valve on the inside open as well. And then you know that there's going to be air movement in there if it needs to. If there's a little bit of water left somewhere in a low spot or something. There is a frost-free tap out there. And you can't see this one very well, but what it is, they're about 18 inches long, and when you turn the tap on and off, it actually turns on and off inside about 18 inches in. And from that valve to the tap, if it's put in with the proper slope, the water will drain out. And there's no water within 18 inches of the outside, so you don't have to turn them off. You just need to make sure there's no hose on the end. They're also supposed to have on them, these guys here, most of you have got them on your house. It's a one-directional vacuum brake. It allows water, so this goes onto your hose outside, your hose bib on the outside, and your hose goes onto that, and it's designed that water can go out, but it can't come back. Okay? So that's so that you're not supposed to be able to contaminate whatever's going on inside your house with whatever might be in the hole. This is not so much a problem anymore because most houses are getting fiberglass enclosures, but old ceramic tiles, if you didn't seal around the taps, you would end up like this, especially when you're using drywall.
Now they're putting water-resistant backing board and then the fiberglass enclosures. Still not a bad idea to do the top half of the spout and even the handles. You don't have to go all the way around. Once the water gets halfway down, it's going to come out. And you don't want to seal it in there, so just the top of the taps is a good idea. Remember that house where they had they closed off the insulation or the intakes in the basement? This was how much moisture they had going up into their attic. It was soaked around the attic hatch, and they were starting to get mold. This was a 1-year-old house, by the way. You want to make sure that attic hatches or attic vents from bathrooms are going right through to the roof. If you've never got into your attic, not a bad idea to look in there. Today the pipes, this isn't very clear here, but they used to just take them up to an opening and leave them there. Now they're actually fastened to a pipe that goes out onto the roof. It's called a gooseneck. You want to make sure. I've seen many of these that have fallen down in attics as well. So it doesn't hurt, and to look at that. And the best time to look at an attic is when it's really, really cold out. That's when you're going to have the most condensation and frost. So when it's been cold for 2 weeks, good idea to poke your head up into the attic in the winter. Some of the tools, I've talked a little bit about some of them here. Thanks to Mike Holmes. This is definitely not the best tool that I carry, but it's definitely the most expensive one. Infrared cameras, most inspectors carry them now. Very, very useful. On the wall here, you can see my handprint. So it didn't take very long with my hand on there to change the temperature. So this can tell me the surface temperatures on everything else. Let's see, over in this corner back here, you can see Nick in there. He's a hot driller. You can see on there, right there, there is a stud going down, right there. So it's a very expensive stud finder, what I'm But if there was something wrong with the insulation, it would show up as a different color because it's a different temperature. And water has the ability, it takes more energy to raise the temperature of water and to lower the temperature of water. So if there's water, if the surface is wet and there's any change in the temperature, it will be a different color because it's either taking longer to get cool or longer to get warm. So it can't see water, it just sees the results of what water can do. And if the insulation has been missed in a corner, it can tell you that. And because I can see the studs don't have a thermal break, they're hotter today than the drywall. That's why I can see them. I can actually see the nails on them because they're a different temperature than the stud. And so it's very sensitive that way, but it can't tell you if it has been wet or it's going to be wet or if there's mold. That's all a fallacy. All it tells you is the temperature. This one tells me what's going on. Okay? If it's wet. Some of the other tools I've got on there, I've got a stethoscope there. Sometimes trying to find a leak in a wall. We do have termites, they're not termites, but carpenter ants. And I did one inspection I was actually down in Palliser. And this house was kept immaculately. And underneath the kitchen sink there was frass in there. Frass is like sawdust. And I said, this doesn't belong. And there was also a few little wings in there, and there was a couple carcasses. I said, I think you've got carpenter ants in your walls here. Went outside and they had an old deck that was starting to deteriorate, and the carpenter ants were in the deck, but they had migrated through the wall and gotten into the house, and they were actually above the kitchen window in the header. They made a nest, and I could hear them through the wall with Cisco. I found that all out, not during the inspection, but after it had been done. I went back and I kept in touch with them, and they actually, I still got the piece of wood. I should have brought it today, but I still got the piece of wood of the header, and it was almost half gone from the carpenter ants. So even though it's not a common problem, they're still around. And carpenter ants, when in the spring, some of them will have wings, and they actually spread. So if you see ants with wings, they could be. They're not all. Sorry, that last one is a little hard to see. This was out in Cochrane again. This is all mold. Now, a grease pit is not a legal thing anyway. They used to, the old mechanics would cut a hole in the floor and dig it down in the garage. They'd lay in there and have somebody drive their car over it and they'd change the oil and whatever they did. This one had been wet, and there was a cover on it when I opened it up, and I've never seen, since then, even, the type of mold that was in there. All the mold needs is moisture. Well, mold will be anywhere. It's got food everywhere, especially cellulose, so wallpaper, drywall. That's why it grows so well in there, is that it loves that. The molds that we don't want. It needs the right temperature, and all you need to add is water. So as soon as you add water, then you get mold. That's just like fire. If you keep the heat away, no fire. In this case, keep moisture away, no mold. In this case, there was mold all the way around in this bathroom. I can't imagine why they didn't do something about it prior to this, but you'd have to take that whole bathroom apart to get rid of it. And that's it. What did we do? Thought we were aiming for one, right? By that. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk to you. And it's been good. I appreciate it. I know we've lost a lot of people, but that's a long presentation. Housing's fun, isn't it? Anybody ever had any real problems that you want to talk about? Pretty good houses?
When you have like flower beds close to the house, how do you, and you water it, that's not really the best thing to do.
No, it's the worst thing you can do, but everybody does it.
I know. So what do you do to, like, you bought the house, it's already there, what do you do to minimize the future impact damage on the house?
The best thing is to take the flower bed out. But we all like them, and I've got flower beds next to my house. Try and put flowers in there that don't need a whole bunch of water, so you don't have to water them much. Because topsoil and dirt doesn't really allow water to run off it very easily. It's almost like a sponge. So your topsoil's got to get really, really wet before the water will run over it, which is good. It feeds those plants and looks after them. But if your ground was sloping this way and you filled it up with topsoil, the ground is still going this way. You know, and if you put grass on it, the grass will kind of work very well at keeping the water because it takes less to saturate the grass and the water will run on it. But it will still build up in there and be wet against your foundation. If you add water next to your foundation, the chances are higher that it will go through. So if you have a problem with a leak, you start on the roof. Make sure your eave troughs are clean. Make sure your downspouts and outspouts are working properly and get the water as far away from the house as you can. The next thing is your surface drainage. 90% of the time, a simple shrinkage crack that's leaking will be controlled by doing that. After that, it's usually easier to do the repair on the inside if you can get at it. If you can't, then you pretty much have to dig it up on the outside. We're talking about a leak. What you're talking about is trying to reduce the risk.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you do a flower bed right, the ground that's underneath it is hard packed, sloping away from the house, and then your topsoil on top of that still has a slope to it, but less at the house and more at the other end, so it kind of produces that slope away. Yeah.
You have a spruce tree
Mm-hmm.
just a few feet from the corner of the house.
Take it out.
Is that a bad idea?
Yep. Spruce trees will grow. They're nice when they come home on Arbor Day.
Yeah.
And they're so cute. Mine from Arbor Day is now 40 feet tall and this big around. And that's only 50 some odd years ago. They should not be any closer than 10 feet. And even 10 feet is really too close for a spruce. And some of the, like a big old poplar or something like that, they should be 20 feet away from the house. They shouldn't be anywhere near. A lot of people think the roots can get in and spread a crack. It can, but that's not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is the roots go down and they go out, and they absorb a lot of water, which is good to keep water away from the house. But soil reacts differently depending on how much moisture is in it. So if you have certain soils with no moisture in it, they have no strength. And if you have the same soil with moisture in it, it has all kinds of strength. So what's more common with trees too close to the house is the bearing capacity of the soil underneath the footing changes because there's no water there. And you'll see the whole corner of the house drop.
So if you just cut, it's hard to dig out the roots, right? So if you just cut it, that's good enough?
On a spruce, yeah.
Just cut it down?
Yeah, some of the elms and poplars, that doesn't stop them. They'll get a little Suckers coming out all over the place. I'm not an arborist, and I would suggest that you have an issue like that. Sometimes it's worthwhile, if it's a nice mature tree and it's a nice one, they'll pay you to come in and take it, if they can get in there, if it's not too big. Because, you know, golf courses and different places will pay a lot of money for a mature tree. But they gotta come in with a tractor and pick up the ground with it. If they can't get in there to do it, then you don't have much choice. But I would get an arborist to come in and look at that. Okay, yep.
For a squeaky road,
Hardwood?
yeah.
Talcum powder. This is laminate here, but it's tongue and groove. So what they got on one side of the floor is it comes down and has a little groove on it, and the next, they nail that down to the floor. The next one fits into it, they nail that one down, the next one fits into it. Now it's wood, so it expands and contracts, and there's all kinds of things that happen. And if it's in the hardwood, you take talcum powder, or baby powder, you put it all over, you sweep it in, you try and get it in there, it's a lubricant. It will work its way in, and it may stop it. Now, if it's the plywood underneath, that won't do anything. And then you got a different problem. If you can get at it from below, sometimes you get PL 400 is the type of glue that they use during construction. Put that on the top of the 2x4 and on the side, push it up into the subfloor, screw it into the joist if you've got a solid joist, or if it's a truss joist, it might be a little harder to do that. But if you do that, then and leave it, it'll glue itself down, and that might stop the squeak.
So hardwood, like, how do you maintain the facility?
Don't use water, just use the cleaning
Yeah.
solution, yeah.
But if you want to repaint it or
Refinish?
refinish it, do
Yeah,
you
there's
do that?
machines out there, sandless.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I wouldn't suggest you do that on your own, unless you've done it before. It's like any trade, you have to have a proper feel.
Yeah.
And if you don't do it right, you can get gouges and uneven. And there's not a lot, depending on the type of flooring that you've got. You know, if it's solid wood, 3/4 inch, then you're a little more forgiving, but you still gotta be very careful. And if it's pre-finished, you gotta be really careful, because there's little grooves in between. And, you know, if you're gonna go to the same color, it would be all right, but if you're gonna change the color, you gotta take it down to below that groove, and you don't have much left past that.
No, I just want to keep the same color, but with time, they start expanding a little bit, and there is little holes between them, so I just want to
Yeah.
do some kind of,
Well, what they do when they refinish is they put glue into those joints, and the sand, as they're sanding it, it mixes with the glue, and it fills those cracks for a while. If it's really bad, they'll come out again eventually. But there's not much you can do. They put the wood in before they finish curing,
right,
and there's not much you can do. You can try increasing the humidity in the house a little bit, but that's pretty hard to control.
but wouldn't you like some kind of cover paint where it's,
If you want to paint it, yeah.
not paint, there's a special thing that you
Lacquer.
lacquer
Yeah.
that would cover it?
It won't, because it'll bridge it, and then it'll break.
Right.
That's why they put the glue in there, and then they sand it, and the glue attracts it, and it's sort of like making a paste.
Yeah.
And it works pretty good if it's a small one, and then they seal that over. Now that supports it. But eventually, if it moves a little bit, that cracks and they fall out again. Might take 10 or 15 years. But there's not much you can do. That's why what they should be doing with hardwood is it should sit in the house for 3 or 4 months before they put it down. It might sit in there for 3 or 4 days.
That's good.
You know, and that's just after they block the branches off it. You know, a lot of it is pretty green on there when they're putting it in. That's, you know, the way construction is. When I did my house, I brought it in and left it. I left it in one room for about 2 weeks before I started.
I know, I'm going to ask a question, just, you know.
Sure.
The windows, like when you have those sealed windows and so on, and sometimes there is moisture in between,
Yeah, the seal. The seal has failed.
okay?
When they put a sealed window together, sometimes they'll use argon gas, and that doesn't have any moisture in it. Or they'll use very dry air. They take in super dry air, they they seal that into it, and that way, when it's in place, if it's cold on the outside, warm on the inside, or vice versa, there's no moisture in there to condense. But once that seal has failed and you get moist air in there, the temperature, depending on, in the summer it might form on the inside, in the winter it's going to form on the outside. And once it's there, there's not much you can do. Now there's companies out there that will drill holes in the glass, and what that does is it lets the air move in there, and often that will stop the moisture from building up in there. But it's almost half the price of the window.
So might as well change.
Well,
Then they change
it
the seal.
slightly reduces the thermal resistance of the window, but not a lot. We actually did it when we had an office and we had a window, and we said, well, let's try it. So we just did it ourselves. Went outside with a drill, with a diamond drill,
Yeah.
and put 4 holes in it. It cleared up, and it was great. But I don't know how effective it. You can't. I don't think you can trust it, because I've seen them with those vents on it. It didn't work.
And the windows, like the aluminum windows, when you close them, after a while, the seals, when you close it, goes off. Are there a company who will look
Yep.
after that?
Yeah, try and go back to the window that manufactured it, that built it. If they're not around, you can try. Chinook Glass on 16th Avenue is usually pretty good. They've got people there that do window repairs. If they can't, they'll maybe shoot you to somebody who will. Yep.
During the last winter, because of the moisture inside the house, there was a bit of ice and stuff.
Yes.
And what happened is when it melted, the frame of the window,
Yeah.
there was some mold
Yeah,
inside. Well, I tried it with some spray, but how did I know?
it's probably okay. Yeah, because it's just when it gets wet again, that mold will come back very quickly, because it's still there.
Okay.
But it usually goes dormant. I'm not a mold expert, but I know that unless you can see it and it's not wet, if it's not wet and you don't see it, it's not really a problem. If it gets wet, it will immediately become active again.
Okay.
So if you want to get rid of it, you got to take the trim off. You might have to cut some of the drywall. It's unlikely it would be into the wood frame.
Mm-hmm.
That takes a long time for a continuously wet before a wood frame breaks down. But it will. If it's every year it gets wet, 20 years, you could have some rotted framing there. But probably by that time the drywall would be falling off. So you normally see those. With cellulose, the more you break it down, the easier it is for mold to build up in it. So that's why cardboard in a basement floor, you'll get mold in that a lot quicker than a piece of 2x4 in the basement floor, because it's more solid, right?
Yeah.
But the wood solid 2x4 will eventually rot too if it's wet for long enough. It takes a long time.